A mysterious young woman approached the boy and handed him a heavy bag. There were gold coins in the bag. With them, she wanted to hire and pay for the services of a gigolo. The young man counted them and asked the girl to enter the establishment and have fun. The interior atmosphere was quite gloomy, but the man she needed was waiting for her at the end of that long hallway. She heard very eloquent sounds coming from behind the closed doors. She wasn't sure if she was doing the right thing. Not long ago, her husband asked her to have a lover, so Luisa decided to follow his advice. So she entered the first door, but there was already a man interacting with other women there. The man wore a mask and smiled cheerfully at the guest. Luisa claimed she had come to that place because they had offered her the services of the best gigolo in the country. At first, the protagonist wasn't going to do this. She was only choosing a dress that her husband would like. She adored Lachard, so as soon as she knew he had arrived, she ran to meet him. The girl missed him terribly and wondered if everything was all right at the estate. The problem was that, practically right after the wedding, he left her here and returned to the estate alone. Without waiting for a reply, he opened the carriage doors and a girl stepped out, whom he introduced as the new maid. Luisa noticed how her husband hugged this girl by the shoulders. Vague suspicions took hold of the young woman's soul. Lachard made up a story that the girl had all her money and luggage stolen. And he couldn't leave her on the street, so he decided to help her and offered her to stay with them. The stranger promised that as soon as she earned money, she would leave his house immediately. And she would go with her mother and sister. This girl even reminded her a little of herself in the past, when she sold fish and worried about sales. On one of those days, she met her husband, who seemed very kind and understanding. Then he bought all the fish she was selling. Luisa idealized her husband, so she felt it was her duty to take care of the girl he brought home. Suddenly, she saw him hugging a stranger in the garden. And he wasn't just hugging her, he was kissing her passionately. This resonated with pain and fear in her heart. So she hid. Morning came. Husband and wife were having breakfast, and Lachard noticed something was wrong with his wife. So he asked her about it. Then he asked her to eat faster, as her favorite dishes were on the table. The man was kind as always and acted normally. So she started to doubt what she had seen. She kept thinking about what she had seen during the night, when suddenly she witnessed a similar scene. Luisa understood that she hadn't been mistaken and that her husband was cheating on her. She didn't understand how it happened. Lachard swore eternal love. Did she bore him already? At that moment, a maid came out of the room and saw her mistress. The young woman justified herself, saying the count had called her to talk. Lachard glanced sideways at his wife, who seemed very disturbed. Luisa couldn't believe or understand why the man acted that way toward her. She loved him with all her being. Faced with this, the count sighed heavily. Lachard approached, leaned in, and told her he loved her more than anyone, but asked her to respect his personal space. The man wanted to enjoy himself, but without her and in his own way. When signing the marriage contract, there was a clause about freedom and privacy. Now she understood its meaning. The key was that if she interfered in his private life, they would divorce. It was the worst scenario for her, as she didn't want to relive her harsh past. So she accepted his conditions. After that incident, the man began showering her with attention, sending flowers and other gifts. He chose her favorites at the store, and she was happy that he remembered the name of the flowers she loved the most. But Luisa was mistaken. The man didn't remember anything, as Helena had helped him choose that bouquet. Helena asked the lady if she minded that she had helped her husband. The protagonist, who hated the idea of living on the street, replied that everything was fine. The count changed women like gloves, but one day he asked his wife if she cared about his mistress. The young woman smiled and said she didn't mind, because in the end, she was still the wife. 3 years passed this way, and everyone murmured that the count's family still had no heir. But the problem was that, if Lachard had an illegitimate child, Luisa would lose her position in that house. That evening, husband and wife were having dinner, and she decided to bring up the issue that was worrying her. Lachard froze when his wife asked him if it wasn't time to have a baby. The Count is not very keen on having children, as he believes they are a lot of work. And he wants to continue living as he pleases. With that, the conversation ended, and the man prepared for another date. She had nothing more to add, except that she was unhappy, so she collapsed as her husband left. She remained seated at the table, watching her husband walk away. She was very sad, as Layard had forgotten their wedding anniversary. Luisa didn't want to go out anywhere that day, but the mansion felt too lonely. For some reason, she thought a walk would relieve her, but on the street her heart shrank even more. And then, suddenly, without expecting it, it started to rain. It wasn't a simple drizzle, but a total downpour. Everyone was running. But she remained motionless. Luisa offered her face to the drops and thought she shouldn't have left home today. Now she clearly understood that her relationship with her husband was beyond repair. Not long ago, she overheard a conversation between her husband and a friend, to whom he confessed that she didn't object to his mistresses. The friend didn't expect the Count to get married, but the essence of that marriage was that the girl was not loved, but rather a convenient wife for Layard. Bystanders began to pay attention to the girl, and she understood that she couldn't change her husband. And if that's the case, how could she find happiness in this life? The rain didn't stop, and she kept walking under it, losing track of time. And only upon feeling a chill did she react. At that moment, she felt cold. She knew she needed to take shelter from the rain, but she had strayed far from the city. And no suitable place was in sight. Suddenly, she spotted an abandoned cabin. The girl entered, and oh, surprise! A young man was there, panting from a wound. Luisa looked at him, unsure how to react to such a sight. The first thing she did was ask him how he was. The man remained silent, but she knew he needed urgent help, so she examined the wound. There was so much blood it was hard to see anything. Suddenly, the young man woke up and grabbed her arm. The stranger demanded to know immediately who this girl was. He suspected someone had sent her and wanted to know who. Luisa was in shock, terrified. She didn't know what the hell to say. And then the young man lost consciousness and fell on top of her. The protagonist did not like this situation at all, and it embarrassed her greatly. Night fell. The girl didn't move. She was with her back to the man and took a while to notice he was waking up. Luisa heard a movement. She turned and asked the man again how he felt. The protagonist asked the man not to make sudden movements, as although she bandaged the wound. He was still weak. The man was surprised that the girl had helped him. Since she didn't have the necessary medicines, she made him an improvised bandage. He realized that this girl had provided him with better help than the knight's. The stranger also noticed that the hem of her dress was stained with his blood. Moreover, she had torn her dress for him. Luisa said she had no choice, it was urgent. That gesture seemed very tender to the young man, so much so that he let out a little laugh. Luisa begged him to stop laughing, or his wounds might reopen. The man obeyed, and then thanked her for saving his life. Now that he was well, she prepared to go home, as her husband must be returning. The stranger stood up and asked her if she wasn't curious to know what had happened to him. The protagonist understood that life has unexpected situations, like what she did today. She wanted to keep this moment a secret, so she said goodbye to the man and walked towards the exit. The stranger felt hurt, as he wanted to entrust her with his secret, and she simply left. How intriguing. Luisa couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen him somewhere before. The next morning, the Count came to see her and acted like a worried husband, asking what had happened to her yesterday. He understood that noble ladies should not dress like his wife did yesterday. He assumed she did it for their anniversary. The man argued that if his wife suffered, he suffered too. That's why he wanted to know what was hurting her. Luisa lied, saying everything was fine, but she noticed her husband smelled of women's perfume. Layard reminded his wife that an important banquet awaited them tomorrow. The Count knew that Duke Lindemann's return would stir up all of high society. At that moment, the young woman was thinking about the stranger and remembered something. That man was Duke Lindemann, Edward Lindemann, the deposed heir of his lineage. A year ago, he left for the Death Forest on an expedition, and this event shook the capital. since darkness reigned there after the dragon's death. Strange things began to happen in the forest. For example, wild animals started using magic. During the expedition, almost all the knights died. And then rumors began to circulate that the emperor wanted to get rid of Duke Lindemann. But oh surprise, Edward returned alive after a few years. The count noticed his wife's lack of attention and, catching her thought, begged for caution. The husband implored his wife to avoid the duke, famous for seducing and using women in black magic. Luisa had run into the duke several times at banquets before. She was sure their paths would never cross again, but how wrong she was. Edward, in front of the king, thanked him for the warm welcome, although he regretted the banquet. The king disagreed, arguing about the duke's long journey under his tutelage. The man smiled, conceding that everything was thanks to the emperor. Internally, the emperor wondered how that guy had returned safe and sound. The ruler clenched his fists. He had heard that the duke suffered trauma. Regardless, the young man thanked the emperor again, but with a terrifying look. The emperor thought to himself that he was not dealing with a particularly good person. Now the throne was occupied by Edward's half-brother, who obtained it through deception. And he tried to assassinate his brother as soon as he succeeded. But no matter how many times they tried to kill Edward, he always survived. Over time, the young man gathered an army of talented warriors. He did not participate in political matters, but reinforced his influence by working on the estate and doing charity work. The emperor felt the threat and sent his brother and his army to the dead forest. But they returned unharmed. By then, the emperor's hatred for the duke had reached its peak. The man wanted to get rid of his half-brother, one way or another. After that conversation, Layard and Luisa approached the duke. Count Clote was delighted by Count Lindemann's return. Edward thanked the count for coming to congratulate him with his wife. The man recognized the girl who saved his life in the count's wife. The duke understood why the girl seemed familiar to him. She hoped he wouldn't tell her husband what happened. Edward looked closely at the girl and smilingly said it was a pleasure to meet her. Luisa said it was a great honor to be at this reception and meet him in person. Something in the duke's and the wife's behavior and conversation did not please the count. Therefore, certain suspicions began to arise in him. At that moment, a beautiful aristocrat was approaching the count and his wife. The stranger was named Liliana, whom Layard smiled at very warmly and kindly. The man confessed that he longed for her arrival, and she was already there, looking into the duke's eyes. The count took the young woman's hand and said that Lady Lillian was new to society. And she congratulated the duke on his return. Layard asked Edward to tell the girl about his expedition, and Luisa stepped aside, aware that her husband's mistress was nearby. Luisa couldn't take it anymore, so she said she felt unwell and was going home. Her husband offered to accompany her, but she couldn't understand how he could say that while holding another woman's hand. It was too painful, so Luisa replied that she could go alone. The duke watched the scene and asked Luisa if he could accompany her, but only if Lady Claude did not oppose it. The proposal surprised Lillian and strained Layard. The count admitted it was the first time he had seen the duke accompany someone. And Edward said it was a happy coincidence, as he also needed to leave. Despite everything, Luisa refused his suggestion. However sad Luisa was, she said she preferred to go home alone. The husband was pleased with her decision. The duke accepted the rejection with dignity, while Layard continued to amuse himself with his mistress. He also noticed how the count treated his wife with contempt. At that moment, several aristocrats were conversing amongst themselves and mocking the duke's attendant. The lieutenant asked them to step aside, as they were obstructing the other guests. The man watched them and understood that his hatred had not diminished, but had grown. At that moment, the lieutenant understood that he should not have gone to that banquet. Luisa watched him. Lady Clote wanted to leave the room as soon as possible, so she thought she should ask the aristocrats to move a little. Suddenly, she recognized one of the men. His name was Maxion. The three men, instantly, focused all their attention on her. Luisa ran towards the lieutenant, happy to see him after so many years. Maxion couldn't explain how the girl had arrived at that banquet. She confessed that she was married and had already been in the capital for 3 years. The rascals couldn't understand how the Countess knew the lieutenant. They didn't believe that Lady Luisa could be friends with a nobody like that. At that moment, murmurs spread. She came from a humble family. The men thought that she and the lieutenant were lovers, so they avoided bothering Maxon. Therefore, they apologized to Lady Clote and wished her a good evening. Maxon thanked her for helping him in that situation. The lieutenant hugged her. He hadn't expected the girl to get married and become a countess. The protagonist knew that her childhood friend had become a member of the Order of Chivalry. And sub-captain. She understood that most likely her friend had traveled with the Duke to that fateful forest. Upon returning home, the young man took a look at his parents' house and was very surprised that the girl was not there. Luisa said that the lieutenant could visit her at the estate, as her husband would not object. Maxon promised to do so. Meanwhile, the Duke approached them. Edward confessed that he had searched everywhere for his substitute, and he was having a good time with Lady Luisa. The girl did not listen to the Duke, and told Maxon it was time to go home. But just as the girl was heading for the exit, she asked the Duke to move as little as possible, since his wound would reopen. Edward understood that even though the girl pretended not to know him, she cared about him. However, Luisa returned to Maxon and told him she would wait for news from him, and then she left. The Duke didn't expect his friend to have such a friend. The boy admitted that she was his childhood friend, but not that she would marry Layard. Edward only wanted to accompany her home and nothing more. And then he told the lieutenant that it was time for them to bid farewell to the rest, recount their feats, and leave with a bang. At that moment, Luisa turned to see if the Duke was following her. After the banquet, Edward and Maxon were sitting at the Duke's estate playing chess. The lieutenant felt that something was worrying his commander. Surprisingly, Maxon won this game. It seemed to the Duke that his friend had started playing better, but the lieutenant noticed that Edward was letting himself be beaten. The captain knew that Maxon was due on guard duty tomorrow and would visit the Clote mansion. And the man confirmed it. The Duke was intrigued whether the lieutenant noticed anything strange about his old friend, but he replied that everything was normal. Edward was consumed by curiosity to know the true essence of the young woman. It was difficult for Maxon to answer, as he hadn't seen Luisa for 10 years. However, the young man agreed to tell everything he remembered about his friend. The first thing he remembered was that the young woman was as kind as the Duke. The man understood that his friend hadn't changed one bit in 10 years. The Duke found it hard to believe that Luisa resembled him, so the lieutenant asked him to forget it. Anyway, Edward asked Maxon not to let his guard down with the girl, as the Count's family supported the Emperor. Although he allowed his colleague to attend to his business. The lieutenant was leaving, but suddenly turned back, puzzled by the captain's sudden interest in Luisa. That raised too many suspicions. The Emperor kept sending assassins after the Duke, and his best friend betrayed him just before the Countess found him. And helped him. He checked the reports and realized that Luisa did not fit into high society. Edward knew she came from a humble family and that it wasn't the first time she had helped someone. But what was she doing near Layard? He knew she had recognized him and wanted to keep their encounter secret to hide his whereabouts. Therefore, he was now burning with the desire to know who Luisa Clote really was. Meanwhile, the maid helped Luisa put on the dress and offered her other options. But the Countess was satisfied with that one. That outfit seemed perfect to her, as it reminded her of the old days. When everything was ready, the Countess ran down the stairs. She was happy to see her old friend again. The man dismounted and was just about to tie up his horse. When he noticed her, the gentleman thanked her for the invitation, as he too was happy to see her again. The protagonist was immensely happy about his arrival. She had so much to tell him. They went in for tea, and she remembered that as a child he loved apple pies. So she prepared one for him. Maxon didn't wait for an invitation and bit into the first piece, which he loved. Luisa noticed that although her friend was big and strong, his character was like that of a child. It turned out that the young man had joined the Order of Chivalry by accident. The girl noticed that the young man looked much happier now than before. Maxon, for his part, asked his friend how she got along with her husband. The Countess hesitated and said she got along well with her husband, although in reality it wasn't true. The man assumed that her husband was a very honorable young man. To change the subject, the young woman suggested to her friend that they go to the garden together, as she wanted to show him everything. They took umbrellas and went for a walk. The young woman also said that if it rained, they would take shelter somewhere. Moreover, there was a strange atmosphere in the house, and then it started to rain. Unfortunately, Luisa's umbrella wouldn't open. Faced with this, Maxim proposed that the young woman go under his umbrella together, as it was large enough. But with every minute that passed, the weather got worse and worse. Suddenly, Luisa saw a gazebo ahead and suggested to her friend they wait there for the downpour to pass. And they ran forward. They quickened their pace as the rain intensified even more. Luisa smiled, as she now felt like she was in her tenderest childhood. And everything would be perfect, except they were soaked, although they were having a great time. Furthermore, Maxim felt blessed to be present there. The Countess admitted that, indeed, there was a special charm in the atmosphere. Suddenly, the young man asked if Mr. Grimm was in the city. Luisa replied that he was not, because he had died. It happened 5 years ago. The boy became distressed and said he had to stay, but she calmed him down. The young man understood that Luisa had had a hard time, something she confirmed. The gentleman did not understand her reaction to the promise that everything would be fine with Layard nearby. The young woman confessed that when she ran away from home, she felt like she was breaking free from a cage. But then she was reincarnated into a new life, even more beautiful. Unfortunately, her life only appeared beautiful. The truth was terribly complicated. And the worst part is that only she could solve this mess. The Duke was heading to Count Cloth's mansion, as his assistant was close to Luisa. So caution would be thrown to the wind. Therefore, Edward decided to personally rescue Maxon from that place. Luisa and Maxon had a lot of fun, and the boy was already preparing to leave. He begged his friend to let her know if anything went wrong. At that moment, Layard appeared at the house and blurted out. He never imagined that her childhood friend was such a strong man. Upon seeing her husband, the girl immediately introduced him to her childhood friend. The gentleman confessed that he was leaving already, so he was glad to meet the Count, who tried to appear friendly. Layard hoped they would have dinner together next time. How romantic. Maxon was already ready to leave, along with his faithful steed. At that moment, the Count tensed up upon seeing a carriage approaching and asked his wife if they were expecting anyone else. The carriage stopped, and an energetic Duke stepped out of it. Edward's appearance left everyone present speechless. The Duke approached the gentleman and informed him that he had come for him. Edward lied, saying he came for his valuable comrade, fearing he would get wet in the rain. The young woman knew the rain wasn't the real reason. She just wanted the man to leave soon. Luisa worried that her husband might find out the details of that day. His fury would be terrible. The young man longed for the day when she would invite him to her estate so they could walk together in their gardens. Layard watched this dialogue in sepulchral silence. Then he burst in and said that even though his estate was not a palace like the Duke's, he would find a corner for the guest. Edward replied that he would eagerly await his invitation. At dinner time, the Count questioned his wife about whether it was improper to associate with such base people. The young woman didn't understand how he dared to judge her childhood friend like that. Layard suspected that the gentleman was just an excuse. The real motive was his superior, as he didn't believe his alibi. The husband reminded his wife that she was a countess now, whereas her friend was a commoner. That offended the girl, since her husband never tired of bringing commoners into their home. When they married, Layard demanded she forget her maiden name, as she now belonged to the Count's family. The protagonist understood that her husband was ashamed of her and didn't care what she wanted. But she wasn't going to give up now. Maxon was her only friend, but then, yielding to his gaze, she said that if he opposed her friendship, she would distance herself. This pleased the man, and then he had an idea. He proposed to his wife to have a lover, as her life was so boring. Luisa didn't want to fight with her husband or ruin his peace, so she also agreed with him on this. Meanwhile, at the Duke's mansion, Maction and Edward were reading the newspapers. Maction was in shock. He had read a letter from Luisa where she told about her husband's proposal. The young woman also asked where to find a lover and if she should look for a gigolo. But the lieutenant couldn't help her with that. Maction was going to write a letter, but didn't know where to start. Interfering in other people's family matters was not right. Besides, he worried that Luisa might go alone to some disreputable place. At that moment, the Duke proposed becoming the Countess's lover. So Maction wrote a reply to his friend. The gentleman couldn't understand why his comrade decided to become his friend's lover. In the letter, the girl read that her friend knew a man who would be perfect for her. The Duke, for his part, confessed that he was bored, so he decided to participate in this adventure. Edward added that, after returning, he took care of all matters on the estates and also wanted to monitor the Cloth family. And this opportunity presented itself. Maction was not sure it was a great idea, as it could be quite dangerous. And he reminded the Duke how he had recently been wounded by someone he would never have expected. Even if Edward didn't admit it, Maction was sure he knew everything perfectly. But he still left with the traitor. Among the Duke's men, there was a young man whose sister had been admitted to the Imperial Hospital. But the boy decided by himself to commit that attack and stain his sword with blood to protect his sister. Maction couldn't forget that moment and worried about his friend. From the gentleman's heavy sigh, the Duke believed he considered him unreliable. Edward personally dictated the text of the letter to his friend. Luisa read the letter and wondered where her friend got such knowledge on the subject. She, for example, was never interested in other women, so she thought her friend burned the letter, and wondered if she would manage to find a lover. The Duke waited for the young woman at a notorious establishment, but she didn't show up again. Rumors about that young woman reached him 3 years ago, when he was informed that Count Clote had married. The young woman's beauty was recognized in high society, but no one knew what family she came from. But at receptions, she made many mistakes at first, which attracted the attention of others. Then, the Duke thought that a quite interesting person had joined his circle. The aristocrats criticized the young woman's lack of manners, but Edward found her charming and unique. But his interest quickly faded, as the girl always hid and ran away. A lot of time has passed since then, and now he was waiting for her in the hotel room. He was tormented by the question of what he would do if she didn't show up today either. At that moment, a waitress approached and asked him if he would like a cup of tea. The young woman served him tea and thought it was strange that someone like him had such hobbies. The man was prepared for new rumors, as there were always many about him. But he never starred in love scandals. Now he understood that his cover and his stay at the hotel would be a source of new gossip. At that moment, the room doors opened and Luisa entered. She was convinced that the best gigolo in the country was in front of her. The maid suddenly recognized who he was, but the Duke stopped her and ordered her to leave. The man stood up and approached the young woman, thinking that he had caught the husband being unfaithful and seeking revenge. Although it could also be that nights with her husband bored her. If that is the case, she certainly knocked on the right door. The young woman confessed that she wanted a lover, and the Duke asked what he would gain from it. He leaned towards Luisa, and suddenly she found him terribly familiar. Although something escaped her, even so, she was willing to give the man everything he asked for. The man liked the proposal, accepted it, and took off the mask. Now she understood that Duke Lindemann was in front of her. That scared her. She apologized and tried to flee at all costs. He didn't let her escape. The most exciting part was yet to come. The man assured Luisa that only he could help her with her delicate matter. And then he added that he never imagined ladies liked frequenting brothels. The girl was outraged, as she had gone there with a specific purpose: to get a lover. The Duke wouldn't yield. He was ready to become her lover. At that moment, Luisa thought he was joking, but he was speaking completely seriously. And so, the young woman accepted his proposal without further hesitation. Edward smiled and considered it an excellent decision. The Duke kissed her hand and promised he would do anything for her, as a lover. After what happened, Luisa couldn't calm down or return to normal. She didn't understand why she had done that. Tormented by the feeling that something was wrong, suddenly, she saw her husband on the stairs, commenting on the bright moon and offering her wine. Luisa looked at him and remembered when she fell in love with his smile, as he once saved her life. Sadness invaded her, knowing she couldn't turn back time. She wanted to talk about her husband's mistress, but feared that doing so would lead to divorce. With few options, she asked her husband to forget it, saying he was just walking around the estate. Layard agreed. He thought it was a great idea and begged her to be careful. Luisa hoped this would be the best for everyone. The next day, the young woman visited the Duke and presented him with a contract. Edward saw it was a contract, but didn't understand its purpose. Luisa confessed she didn't understand why she wanted a lover or what to do with him, so she wanted to detail everything. The protagonist didn't want them to act married. She didn't even consider them lovers. Edward was astonished, as she didn't quite understand what lovers were, so he educated her. Even so, Luisa clarified that they would be lovers, but not for real. Additionally, she confessed she had a marriage contract with Layard. Edward was surprised. Were contracts fashionable? He considered himself more useful than any gigolo. He was the most famous man in the capital. Suddenly, Luisa asked him what interested him so much about her. He replied, "It's simple entertainment." Then, he suggested she be honest about her desires, as he would be a very useful chess piece. While she thought about his offer, he began to examine the contract. The document was trivial, but the clause for breaking up due to falling in love revealed his aversion to love. Luisa openly confessed that it was her husband who suggested she have a lover. The Duke grasped the essence of the situation and recognized the strength of that woman. More than anything in the world, she longed for her husband to understand her feelings. Therefore, she hoped the Duke would help her in this battle and lead her to victory. Edward proposed a bold move to Luisa at her husband's new mistress's party. And for that, it was essential that they pretend to be deeply and hopelessly in love. This displeased Luisa, and she flatly refused that proposition. She knew the Duke had his own reasons, but for her, this was not a game. It was something very serious. The man corrected himself and clarified that they only needed to seem in love. Luisa asked what she should do to achieve it, and then she remembered something she had read in novels. And she told the Duke about it. Edward was surprised by her quickness, but thought it was enough for now and that she should practice in front of the mirror. Once everything was agreed upon, the young woman went to get ready. The Duke remained alone, thinking that he had met an amusing girl. At that moment, Maxim entered the study and the Duke wanted to ask him some questions. The lieutenant also had news. He said that movement by the Emperor had been noticed and preparations for a fencing competition. It was decided to invite Eduarda to the tournament to assess her skills. The Duke understood that the Emperor's intentions were obvious. He wanted to exile him from the capital or harm him. The man was tired of his brother's intrigues and knew it was time to kill him. Despite all the difficulties, knights from all over the empire were going to attend the tournament, and there were rumors that the one who remained alive at the end would win. And the reward was supposed to be the sword of Lentia. Edward thought his brother was crazy to give away the crown's treasures like that. The man understood that he needed to start special training. Maxim knew he wasn't good enough. But in the capital, there was someone perfect. The lieutenant admitted that he had never managed to defeat that man. At that moment, Edward knew that the man his friend was talking about must be incredibly strong. The Duke understood that such a man would be useful to him in the future. Edward asked Maxim to introduce him after the banquet, and then asked if Luisa had any special preferences. Maxim remained silent, and the Duke added that the girl said she would never fall in love with him. It seemed strange to the Duke, as no one had ever told him no until now. Maxim's face expressed complete incomprehension and abstraction. Meanwhile, Layard and Luisa were heading to a reception with the man's mistress. After the meeting with the Duke, the girl felt uncomfortable with Layard, and he began to notice it. And so, in silence, they reached their destination. Lillian received them at the entrance. The girl said she had thought about Layard the whole time while preparing for the reception, ignoring his wife. The man didn't care about his wife either and went off with his acquaintances. He even told her she could go home and he was tired. Luisa, for her part, planned to enjoy that night's banquet. He was shocked but didn't show it, wishing her a good evening. The Count, for his part, went to have fun with his mistress. The aristocrats gossiped, saying Luisa had no pride attending her husband's mistress's reception. At that moment, the Duke approached and commented that her husband had fled too quickly. He then gallantly offered her a glass of wine. The young woman accepted the glass, and they decided to put their plan into action. It was unexpected, but the Duke was confident in the move's success. And then, accidentally, she spilled the glass of wine on the floor. In this way, she managed to capture the attention of everyone present. Edward embraced her tenderly and asked if she was okay. At that moment, Layard's face began to transform. The man and the woman stared at each other. She assured him she was fine. The Duke expressed his relief that she wasn't hurt and suggested they move away from the danger. Luisa worried that no one would believe them, but Edward assured her that it went perfectly. He then asked if she noticed any change in the atmosphere. Now, all eyes and comments focused solely on them. Moreover, he warned the young woman that they needed to prepare, as this was only the beginning. After saying this, he leaned towards her hand and begged her to grant him the first dance. It was quite a striking declaration. The Duke was inviting someone to dance for the first time. Luisa swallowed and agreed to dance with him, unleashing a whirlwind of murmurs around them. The guests noticed that the Countess and the Duke had already spent time together at the previous ball. Layard was starting to get angry. And then he invited Lillian to dance. And two couples spun near each other. Luisa felt uncomfortable, and Eduardo told her to enjoy this moment. The man didn't care about future rumors. He was going to entertain the crowd well, as everyone understood what the first dance to that melody meant. After that, he pulled the girl towards him, which outraged and embarrassed her at the same time. But then she looked around and realized that an interesting atmosphere had formed around them. The Duke was so close to her that she could feel his breath. However, she still felt uncomfortable by his side, because the more she looked into his eyes, the more uncomfortable she felt. This was interesting, as she spoke with great confidence when looking him in the eyes. And suddenly, the Duke blurted out to the girl that her husband reacted strangely to their dance. What's more, the Count kept glaring at them. Luisa thought, "My husband is starting to get jealous." The music stopped, and all the couples froze. But the Duke reminded the protagonist that they hadn't finished their little show yet. Meanwhile, Layard dragged Lillian into the garden. The man, furious with the Duke, completely ignored his mistress's protests. A few minutes earlier, in the hall, Lillian had proposed another dance to the man. And he was about to accept until he saw his wife leaving with the Duke. And to top it off, she looked super happy. Layard dragged his mistress into the garden, hoping to see his wife, who was behaving strangely. At that moment, he saw the Duke tenderly embracing his wife, about to kiss her on the balcony. And then the man's lips touched Louis's forehead in a fleeting caress. This enraged the Count, and he decided to spend the night with his mistress as soon as possible. After this, he passionately kissed the young woman. But Louis saw nothing, and her husband didn't understand what she was thinking or what she intended. Lillian literally threw herself at the Count. The Duke watched this scene with contempt. The Duke approached the young woman and hugged her, saying that if they were watched from below, it would seem like they were very close. She understood that he was right. The man smelled of roses, and suddenly his scent seemed painfully familiar. The young woman chased away those strange thoughts. She was intrigued how Layard would react to her prank and if his attitude towards her would change. Edward smiled and said that everything had gone quite well. But in reality, the Duke didn't understand what his husband was thinking by putting on that spectacle downstairs. The man didn't understand the reason for that behavior, nor why Luisa trusted such a person. The man said that if they obtained the desired result, she could step aside. But for now, they shared a secret, and he asked permission to withdraw. Then, with his teeth, he removed the glove from her hand to kiss it. Such behavior greatly disconcerted the young woman, but it was exactly what she needed. And he kissed her hand. Luisa noted to herself that her heart was beating too fast. Layard moved away from his mistress and observed what was happening on the balcony. Then he took Lillian to his quarters, under the pretext that they couldn't continue in the garden. The Duke, who was watching the Count, noticed that he had left. Luisa confessed that if something like this happened again, she wouldn't be able to bear it. The man didn't believe the young woman was cold towards him and offered to accompany her to the carriage. The protagonist knew that while the Duke was heir to the empire, all the girls were crazy about him. But for some reason, the man postponed his engagement, and she wondered if he was as handsome as the newspapers claimed. His mother used to say the prince was ugly, but now the protagonist understood that was a lie. She thought he was more handsome than Layard, and that he also had a lot of experience in romantic matters. Suddenly, the Duke asked her to call him by name, as they had made their relationship public. After the ball, Edward took her home in his carriage. The maids received them and immediately started whispering. Layard didn't return home that day, nor did he appear for days, and upon returning, he said he was very tired. And he was going to rest. Meanwhile, at the estate, Duke Maction was dealing with matters. High society continued to comment on the ball, but urgent matters needed to be addressed. Only the Duke had no desire to work. However, he let his friend into the room, but felt he had changed. Since he didn't believe that society was still talking about the ball. It turned out that Edward was worried that Luisa hadn't liked him, which surprised Maction a bit. But as soon as the Duke heard that he had received a letter from Luisa, he lit up instantly. The content of the letter didn't surprise him much, as it was exactly what he expected. Immediately afterwards, he decided to reply to the girl. Luisa asked if she could visit him. He replied and asked a friend to deliver it to her. The childhood friends hadn't spoken since that day at the hotel, so the Duke hoped they would reconcile. Maction also hoped so. The lieutenant was there and handed the letter to the girl, who said that he had devised an interesting plan. The boy tried to justify himself, but Luisa said that had been the most awkward moment of her life. But then she said she forgave him because she knew very well that he cared about her. She herself understood that she had acted foolishly by deciding to look for a gigolo. Before, the girl immediately turned to him for help. But since she entered those circles, she had become very boring. The young man, on the other hand, considered her a very strong girl. And he said it completely seriously. What a declaration! That struck her with memories of the past, when she thought she was invincible. But before, she feared nothing. Now she felt completely powerless. In high society, unfortunately, she was too vulnerable. Suddenly, Maction surprised her by asking if she would train someone in fencing. The young woman became alarmed and confessed to her friend that she was hiding her skills. She lost the opportunity to tell her husband. He thinks she is a peasant girl. Her mother had advised her to keep it a secret. What a burden! Therefore, her friend's proposal seemed inopportune to her. What a dilemma! Even so, if she wanted to practice, she could visit him whenever she wanted. The girl thought for a moment and asked permission to come today. They left on horseback, and Maction feared the gossip, but it suited her. A short time later, they arrived at the Duke's mansion. The lieutenant guided his friend to the training hall. The young man pointed to a shelf with swords and told her she could take one. The girl chose a wooden one because she only wanted to warm up a bit. 4 years had passed since she last held a sword, but the skill remained intact. Maction realized she hadn't lost her old dexterity. Luisa was delighted and asked for training clothes. The lieutenant said he would bring her clothes as soon as he told Edward. Suddenly, the girl stopped her friend and asked why he had brought up fencing. The man decided to pretend he didn't understand what she was talking about. The protagonist understood that he had brought her here and put a sword in her hands so she would change her mind. Maction protested and said he just wanted the girl to smile again. He remembered how much she liked doing that. Luisa understood the boy's motivations well. After all, he is her friend. Therefore, she was not mistaken, as she changed her mind and wanted to know who she should train. The young woman did not expect her friend to suggest training the Duke. However, she thought she shouldn't worry about the man. After all, he returned alive from the forest of the dead. Luisa remembered his wound. It wasn't deep, but it bled a lot. Someone was threatening Edward. That idea tormented her relentlessly. The protagonist agreed to help them, but with one condition. She planned to use those men for her purposes. Maxon didn't understand anything, so she whispered her proposal in his ear. The lieutenant went to the Duke and informed him that the fencing master would wait for him at sunset on the training ground. Edward accepted, considering that if someone was talented, they were worth listening to. Maxon also said that Luisa would give the answer to the Duke in person, and then asked to use something from his wardrobe. Edward consented. The man remembered it, but this time he felt incredibly uncomfortable. He hoped Luisa would be all right after his request. The clothes the boy brought his friend were a little too big for her. Maxon feared the shirt would be too big, so he promised to bring clothes of her size next time. Once she changed, the gentleman asked her to show him what she was capable of. There was still time before sunset, so she wanted to relax a bit. However, the young man longed to have a practice bout. In the end, the girl agreed. Luisa was very nervous, as she hadn't been home in a long time, so she hoped not to disappoint her friend. Maxon noticed her tension and was no longer so happy to have caused all this. Because from the first move, she practically landed a winning blow on him. Although he managed to fend off the attack with effort, Luisa was happy, as her friend's skills had improved tremendously. His stance had also become much firmer. That showed that the boy had matured. Maxon didn't understand why his friend was smiling. Suddenly, the girl launched a new attack. Maxon blocked her strike, but it cost him a lot. After a while, they finished the training, and she said he wielded the sword much better. She, on the other hand, began to feel lighthearted, as everything else seemed like a lie. Yes, the boy improved, but she didn't understand how they endured a year in the forest if he was the best of the group. The protagonist didn't understand what her friend meant when he said the forest had changed. At the time, she herself fled the forest, as she longed for the light then. Now it was impossible to recover the former forest. The sun was beginning to set, so she knew she had to prepare for the meeting with the Duke. And indeed, Edward arrived at the training ground. The girl put on the mask, while the man hoped that this person would be at least competent. Luisa noticed the man's disappointment upon seeing it was a girl. Edward protested and brandished his sword. The man didn't understand what the hell was going on, as he knew immediately that Countess Clote was in front of him. The first thing he noticed was the Duke's terrible posture, but he realized it was unlikely to be another joke from his friend. First of all, he wanted to see what the man was capable of. The girl begged the Duke to attack her. This proposition shocked the man. The Duke looked at his friend, asking for help, but he was just watching. The girl, insistent, demanded that the man attack her at once. His patience was running out, and she pointed her sword at his throat, criticizing his grip, demanding once again that the combat begin. The man saw the duel as a problem, unable to attack her. He thought it was revenge, but he hesitated when she said she would evade his attacks without a sword. He decided to be cautious, but she dodged sharply and almost fell. He didn't understand what was happening, while Luisa demanded he repeat the attack. She begged him to graze her body with the sword at least once. The Duke thought he was slow only because he was afraid of hurting her. The man tried again, but failed once more. On the third attempt, he decided to strike the tip of the sword so as not to hurt the girl. And he missed again. At that moment, the Duke began to suspect something strange was happening. And Luisa demanded that he repeat the attack one more time. The sun set, and Maxon turned on the magical light in the training ground. The Duke could barely stand. The man couldn't understand how Luisa had managed to evade all the blows. She knew the Duke wouldn't hit her, so she offered her sword and challenged him to do it. Then she removed her mask and asked him when he was finally going to focus. Edward confessed that he hadn't imagined the Countess was so good at the art of fencing. The protagonist did not expect him to ask her to become his personal teacher. The young woman was astonished to realize that the man had known who she was for a long time. He apologized for not taking the training seriously and for thinking it was revenge for what happened at the hotel. The man didn't understand why the Count was unfaithful, having such a skilled wife. He even thought Layard was crazy, and that resurrection with black magic was possible. Incredible. Suddenly, the Duke realized that Luisa's husband didn't know about her skills. His reaction confirmed it. Edward was right, as the girl was capable of healing people and was an excellent swordswoman. He didn't understand why she kept it a secret. She didn't plan to hide it at first, but her marriage wasn't based on knowing each other well. Layard needed an obedient wife, and she longed for another life. So when they married, she no longer had to wield a sword, but she was far from Layard's ideal. That's why the Count had no idea she was training with the Duke. Edward realized that he was the first in the capital to discover her skills. Now this was her second secret. For the Duke, this was not a problem. And Luisa told Maction that she once provided first aid to the Duke when he was bleeding out. Now everyone knew, so it was time for dinner. The proposal to have dinner, the three of them together, took her a bit by surprise. But both men were smiling kindly, and she felt comfortable with them. 10 days had passed since that first lesson. Luisa visited him again. The maids had already talked about her. This time she arrived earlier than expected and found him training. Like the previous time, she put on his clothes. The Duke noticed that his appearance had made her uncomfortable, so he quickly put on a shirt. Luisa knew that the man was very unwell at first, but now she was beginning to see the fruits of her lessons. And then she asked him if he knew that the maids were looking at them very strangely. It's simple, the employees thought they were having a secret affair. Besides, the servants were forbidden from entering the training ground. Initially, she thought something like that, as she wanted to provoke her husband. And she succeeded, as not long ago Layard came home completely drunk. He informed his wife that he had broken up with his mistress, as they were incompatible. And then he asked his wife if she really thought the Duke was right for her. The Count began to behave inappropriately, saying he had warned her that the Duke was a dangerous man. And then, for the first time in a long time, he kissed her. Afterward, he hugged her and said he was glad about her relationship with the Duke, and even gave the green light for her to invite him home. In this way, he was giving her total freedom of action. Luisa understood her husband even less than before. Edward thought she was very affected by the maid's gossip. That's why he decided to propose an outing outside the mansion. In this way, he invited her on a date. Since the young woman was now his teacher, he wanted to buy her suitable clothes for it. Moreover, she was his lover. And although he loved that she came to see him every day, it wasn't enough. After all, they needed to go out into society from time to time. Luisa understood that the Duke was completely right. The protagonist hoped that the young man would not miss the training sessions. So they went shopping. And in one shop, the owner told the Duke that he never thought the rumors were true. The man, for some strange reason, believed that the Duke liked men. And he expected him to confess it. What's more, he thought Edward was dating Maction. Filio was glad the Duke was leaving royalty, but didn't understand his romance with a married woman. The merchant noticed that Edward was studying her tastes, although this was too much. Just at that moment, the young woman finished trying on clothes and went out to the men. She was curious about his opinion on the outfit and how it looked on her. She looked splendid, and Edward reaffirmed that these were his tastes. Filio knew he set fashion trends, and this boutique had beauties. But she chose a masculine suit. The only thing that made him happy was that no scandal had arisen. The good thing was that Edward liked it, and he asked her to look at more clothes. Since this was the case, Filio suggested looking at another masculine line, and that they would adapt it to her figure. The Duke understood that it was hot, and the clothes needed changing often, so he decided to buy more. The merchant's attitude changed instantly when large sums of money were mentioned. Luisa felt that the Duke was going a bit too far. The money he was willing to spend could buy several plots of land. For her, it was total waste, so she begged him not to spend so much money on her. Since she didn't want men's clothes, Edward proposed buying new dresses, as they would go to balls. That sounded convincing enough. Filio did not miss the opportunity and led them to the dress salon. Even if the couple seemed strange to him, there were many outfits, and Luisa even thought about what to choose. So she decided it would be good if he chose a dress for her. But the Duke asked her to choose what she liked, not what he or Layard liked. Besides, he thought his opinion wouldn't help her, as he liked her even in men's clothing. Suddenly, the man noticed that the young woman forgot to button her cuff and decided to fix it. At that moment, Luisa realized that this man could be very tender. And when she thanked him, he drew her hand closer and brushed it against his chest. Luisa sharply withdrew her hand, as she was beginning to experience strange sensations. Therefore, the girl turned around and asked for several dresses to try on. Filio hurried to please her and gave her several outfits to choose from. The shopping ended, and the Duke ordered that all the chosen dresses be sent to his estate. The man and the woman left the store, and he asked her to take his arm. Luisa thanked the Duke for the gifts and said she would gladly wear them, although the protagonist worried she had behaved a little strangely in the store. They were walking down the street and noticed a crowd vehemently discussing something. Luisa was curious to know what was happening further down. Suddenly, everyone turned towards them and started commenting on their relationship. The Duke and the Countess had confirmed it. Fortunately, the crowd parted on its own. People thought the man and the woman looked very good together. They approached a bulletin board where the official announcement for the Imperial Fencing Tournament was posted. Edward was struck by the fact that an oracle was supposed to present at the ceremony. The Duke confessed that it had been quite a long time since the imperial family organized such an event. The young man understood that the emperor had a plan, but he still couldn't decipher what it was. The protagonist was interested in something else. If it was true that the winner was given the sword of Lentia. She said she was curious, as she had only read about it in books. The Duke perfectly understood that Lentia's feats were told everywhere, and everyone knew them. And the girl already said that sword was an imperial treasure. Suddenly, she asked if anyone could participate in those competitions. Edward suddenly assumed she wanted to participate, but the girl said no, and that it was simple curiosity. The man knew there were no sex or status restrictions in that tournament. But there were traps, as all the newspapers would start harshly criticizing her. However, seeing each other after this would make them even better. Luisa understood the whole complexity of the situation. The extra training ended, and the Duke was resting in his room. He knew his muscles would ache for a couple more days. He also saw perfectly that Luisa was interested in the Lentia sword, and her desire to win was greater than his. He remembered a moment from the past, a knight asking him, as a child, to glorify his name after his death. It was the perfect moment to do it. Even if he didn't become emperor, it was Lentia who started teaching him fencing. She defeated the dragon, and the little prince knew everything about her. The butler bowed, leaving Eduardo alone with Lentia. The training began. The boy wielded the sword while the knight observed. Before, he thought he would learn something great. She killed a dragon, but now Lentia forced him to do boring and repetitive things. Suddenly, the knight stopped the training and asked him why he was learning fencing. He thought that, as heir, he should at least know the basics and be able to hold a sword. Lentia understood that the boy was not enthusiastic about learning fencing. It was more of an obligation as an heir. Since this was the case, she proposed playing, since she didn't have as many subjects to study in her childhood as he did. At first he wanted to protest, but then he decided to obey. After all, she was a dragon slayer. The first time, they simply decided to lie down on the green grass under a tree. The second time, they chatted, and he confessed that he feared becoming a bad emperor. Lentia told him that if he attended the basic training, he would learn quickly. But the boy feared the emperor would expel her. This didn't scare her too much, as for her it would even be the best possible option. Because her husband and son were waiting for her at home, whom she hadn't seen for over a month. And then she asked the boy to promise her something. The woman begged him to take care of her daughter if he ever met her. The boy promised he wouldn't do anything against the young woman's will, and Linsha noticed that the girl looked a lot like her. This meant that the boy might fall in love with her. Looking at the woman, the boy understood that this way he was supporting her. One fine day, Linsha confessed that this would be her last lesson. This meant they couldn't play together again. Months after becoming a teacher, the knight left the capital. The reason was that the boy didn't progress in fencing, but he mastered the basics. But he understood that it was the right thing for her, as her family was waiting for her. Now, although he didn't remember her features, he felt he had to keep his promise. The Duke thought it was a great idea for Linsha and Luisa to meet someday. The ball arrived, and the protagonist tried with all her might to smile. Eduardo knew it was more of a grimace than a smile, but it was the best he could manage. The aristocrat said that Lady Clote was famous now, and she had to be watched closely. Seeing that Luisa could no longer stand the attention, the Duke took her to the garden, laughing because she and Layard were the most famous unfaithful couple. She received tons of invitations to events, but the Duke thought she should seize the moment, because she would never be in the eye of the storm again. Even so, she didn't understand how he could take everything so lightly, but he was having a wonderful time. Luisa noticed that this labyrinth garden was larger than others, and it was easy to get lost in it. By attending balls with Eduardo, she learned many new things she hadn't known before. Specifically, that every estate had a place for lovers' secret meetings. They were right in such a place, but there must also be a corner like that in her house. She just never used it. Today, her husband went to the ball with a new mistress, and he didn't even look at her with the Duke. Up to this point, she still held out hope that he would be jealous of her, even a little. After all, he was completely absorbed in his new romance. Luisa was beginning to understand that it had been foolish to expect anything from Layard. The Duke, for his part, immediately noticed that his companion had become saddened. Suddenly, a count approached with his mistress and greeted the couple. Eduardo pretended not to have noticed the count's presence at the ball until that moment. The count's mistress told Luisa that she planned to visit them and proposed having dinner together. That woman thought her proposal was great, since they could all have fun in the future. But the stranger was not the first to behave this way towards Luisa. She was about to refuse when the Duke intervened, saying it was an excellent idea, and the four of them should have dinner. Layard's companion thought it would be a double date, and Luisa remembered her husband's words about doing whatever she wanted. So she said that Edward would now be a frequent guest. The Count didn't expect that, but he agreed, although he warned his wife that he probably wouldn't be home until the weekend. As soon as Layard left, the Duke congratulated the girl on the good counterattack. Edward couldn't believe that Layard spent time with mistresses, and also with his wife. It was worse than a soap opera. And then he proposed to Luisa to meet alone with him at his mansion, at the same time as her husband with the mistress. In other words, he was proposing they spend the night together. Sunday arrived. All those involved sat at the table having dinner, and the Count's mistress asked the Duke if he was thinking of getting married. To this, the man replied that it was necessary to respect the opinion of the loved one. Luisa choked on her wine at such audacity. This situation was ridiculous, and the Count's mistress was already saying that Luisa and Eduardo made a good couple. Layard suddenly remembered that the Duke was interested in the garden, but the weather wasn't ideal for a walk. Eduardo wasn't discouraged, as he expected the Count to invite him to his house many more times. Then he added that although the garden was beautiful, it didn't compare at all to Countess Clote. The Duke enjoyed her reaction, so she also decided to play with his nerves. And she languidly said she was bored. It turned out she wanted to show Eduardo a special rose that had bloomed in his garden, because its color reminded her of the color of the man's eyes, and every time she took care of the flower, she thought of him. This made the man smile, and the young woman wondered how he managed to do something like that while sane. Then she asked him to tell her the variety of the rose, as he also wanted to take care of the flower. And think of her. His words embarrassed the young woman for the umpteenth time. Layard and his mistress also felt the awkwardness of the situation. Count Cloth put down his knife and fork and suggested going to the rooms, as it had gotten late. Luisa understood perfectly what her husband meant, so she felt sad. She felt she had enough strength to pretend not to notice anything. And maybe alone she couldn't handle this, but today her support was the Duke, who said they should leave too. But he still didn't know where her room was, so he politely asked the young woman. And so they moved to their chambers. The young woman took a bath. Now Luisa understood that she was able to endure that dinner only thanks to Edward's strange support. She was glad to know that behind the wall there was a person on her side. Suddenly, in the window she saw the silhouettes of her husband and his mistress, locked in a kiss. The girl felt uncomfortable, so she immediately drew the curtains. When she first arrived at this estate, she loved this window, as the view was wonderful. Unlike dark perils, through it, light flooded the room, and she could only think of hopes. Happiness and a bright future. But now everything has changed, and someone knocked on her door. It was Edward, who had trouble falling asleep in a new place, and since she wasn't asleep yet, he would like to spend some time with her, even though it was very late. Although the night was for lovers, she didn't want to develop such a relationship with him. Something the man knew. The man behaved this way because he felt like someone was watching them. The Duke was sure that the Count wanted to check if they were together or not, so he decided to play along. Because after all, he had come as a lover. Luisa let him into the room. The situation was ambiguous, so they looked at each other in silence, expectantly. Suddenly, the protagonist realized the danger and wanted to breathe. But the climate was adverse. She gave up going out, opting to slightly open the window towards the terrace, seeking a breath of fresh air. Just then, Eduardo questioned her. Was he perhaps a tool to soften her husband's heart? It wasn't true, because nowadays he represented a valuable friendship for her. But he knew it wasn't entirely true. With Maxion, she held hands freely. She avoided him. Luisa worried that so much closeness could be mistaken for a real romance. Eduardo reminded her that her husband might not change, even by prolonging their fake romance. She knew it and proposed spending time together, including Maxion. She was satisfied with that. The man fell silent and then nodded. If she was happy, everything was fine. He wouldn't insist. Suddenly, a strong wind blew and Luisa almost fell. The Duke helped her close the window and said that if the Count entered her room, many things could change. But she knew perfectly well that her husband wouldn't come to her that night. Eduardo wasn't so sure, as it was the first time he slept there. So it was uncertain what the Count would do in that situation. The problem was that Layard hadn't come to her room even once since the wedding. And their wedding night. The Duke thought it was because of the contract, but the young woman said it was because she was ugly. And she asked him to close his eyes. The man closed his eyes, and she decided to expose her back. And then she placed her hand on his back and asked him to touch her. The Duke, without opening his eyes, began to caress her back. There were deep scars on her back, so he thought about the life this young woman had led up to that moment. The protagonist perfectly ignored the depth of those scars and still remembered her husband's face upon seeing them. She understood perfectly that she had become a withered flower for her husband. In spite of everything, the man maintained his composure and gave her sweet words on their first night together. But she had the impression that he was in a great hurry that night. She wanted to touch her husband, but he moved away from her contact. At that moment, she understood that Lehart felt repulsion for her body. It wasn't a night of love, but a night to fulfill an obligation. From that day on, the young woman began to torment herself, thinking she was so ugly that not even a butterfly would land on her hand. The Duke knew it was nonsense, as she was far from being someone deteriorated. She begged him not to comfort her, as she was fully aware of her situation. Suddenly, Edward opened his eyes and confessed that before, only beauty and perfection surrounded him. He loved the aesthetic, the beautiful, and surrounded himself with people who met his requirements. Life changed him, but no one noticed something crucial about him. His standards rose so high that ordinary beauty no longer interested him at all. Therefore, the only beauty that captured his attention as he matured. "It was you." But Luisa didn't believe him. She feared that upon looking closely, he would hate her like Layard. At that moment, the man hugged her tightly. Indignation and shame flooded her. The Duke swore to her that he would not touch her without her consent. Moreover, if he had to compare her to a flower, he would say that flowers are too weak. Because no flower in the world will learn to wield a sword as masterfully as her. And he didn't say it to calm her down, but because he truly meant it. The protagonist thanked him. Besides, she had to leave, as the servants already suspected they spent time together. This offended the young man, as he felt that she had underestimated his skills. Only 30 minutes had passed. Luisa didn't understand what was happening, as she thought it was enough time. She was frustrated, not being able to prove her point or her abilities. Luisa blushed and said she believed him. In spite of everything, the Duke left her room and the young woman was left alone. Upon entering his room, the young man drank a potion and began to feel his condition worsening. Eduardo knew it would be very difficult for him to fall asleep tonight. Dawn broke, the day was radiant, and Luisa and Eduardo went for a walk in the garden. They approached a rose bush, and the Duke asked her if it was the rose she talked about yesterday. It was, but she said the color of her eyes resembled the flowers, only due to the mood of the moment. That didn't affect Eduardo's mood today, which was simply wonderful. The man understood that she would constantly remember him when looking at those flowers. Suddenly, Luisa realized that the man's eyes looked like real rubies. The man noticed that the girl didn't deny it. It was true, she had already gotten used to his ambiguous words. The protagonist understood that red roses would always remind her of the Duke. Fencing training continued. Now Maxion and Eduardo worked together, and the lieutenant suggested a break. Maxion noticed that the Duke had improved a lot, and Eduardo himself knew it. Maxion confessed that Luisa was the one who trained him when his master was busy. But the Duke couldn't hear about Luisa's childhood, and a girl approached them with a real sword. She said that, starting today, they would fight with real swords, because soon there would be a fencing competition. At that moment, Eduardo told his friend that it would have been better to hire an assassin for his training. The Duke noticed that lately training sessions started later than usual. And it was true, something had happened, but it would soon be resolved. Maxion watched his friends, but understood that they had been behaving very strangely lately. They went to a banquet, and the Duke proposed betting a wish on whether the lavender would bloom. Or not, and the girl accepted. Maxion understood that something dangerous was happening between those two. Luisa returned home, and Layard was surprised, as he thought she would go to the banquet with the Duke. The girl confessed that she needed to change her dress, and her husband replied that, since this was the case, they should go to the ball together. Suddenly, the Count noticed that his wife looked happy these days. Luisa confessed to him that she had fulfilled her wish and taken a lover. Her husband congratulated her, but something didn't add up. It was very strange. They traveled to the ball in a sepulchral silence. The tension was palpable. After their training, the Duke told Luisa that at today's banquet, Mrs. Scylla would receive a marriage proposal. None other than his wife's mistress, with whom she recently dined. It was strange that the Count amused himself with those women. It was rumored that Mrs. Scylla had been dating another man for a long time. Luisa wondered if her husband knew about the proposal and if he would be okay after that. Finally, they arrived at the ball. The man wished his wife to have fun. Unexpectedly, the protagonist stopped him dead in his tracks. Luisa asked him to call her if he needed her, as something bad could happen at the ball. The man understood that she was referring to his marriage proposal to his mistress. Layard begged his wife not to put on a sad face. And Sheila was just his mistress, with whom he had fun. And then he added that, no matter how many women he had, none would be his real wife. Because no matter how much time he spent with other women, he always had a reason to return home. That's why he asked her to have fun now, because when the sun rose, the dream would end. After this, he left, and she watched him walk away, understanding that she shouldn't expect anything else from her husband. She didn't understand why she was still clinging to that man. At that moment, Eduardo approached and asked her why she was standing there. The young woman was beginning to understand that perhaps Lejar was right. Her life had turned into a beautiful dream with the Duke's arrival. And it was thanks to him that she picked up the sword again and felt alive and happy anew. The Duke knew something was wrong, even though she insisted it wasn't. But they had a bet about the lavender blooming. So he suggested going to the field now and grabbing the best spots. They arrived first, and a beautiful view unfolded before them. But the buds had not yet opened. Not yet. That meant she had won their bet. Victory! Suddenly, she understood that Eduardo did it to cheer her up. He knew the lavender wouldn't bloom at sunset, but Eduardo hadn't admitted his defeat yet. Who knows, maybe it would bloom. Even so, the victory was hers, so she ruled that next week she would double the training sessions. It was next to him that she smiled constantly, but she feared this dream would end and they couldn't remain friends. But the truth was that she herself understood that they couldn't be friends. Suddenly, the man asked her to look forward, and upon doing so, she saw the lavender bloom. Definitely, that was her victory in the argument. And since this was the case, it was her time to make a wish. Luisa looked at him and asked what his wish was. The atmosphere around them changed drastically. At that moment, they heard a girl scream and beg to be left alone. It was Isilla and her fiancé. The girl shouted that everything was over and that she was now dating someone else. The girl accused the man of having said himself that he did not see a woman in her. The Duke and the Countess hid behind a tree. They understood that the arguing couple were the culprits of today's celebration. Luisa understood that it was not the right atmosphere for a proposal. Something happened between them. She also understood that she always got into strange stories when the Duke was around. And if she didn't understand why he came now? If he always criticized her when he wasn't around? The young man confessed that it was a quarrel between colleagues. If he spoke, there would be rumors. That's why he spoke ill of marriage. He didn't want to criticize her directly. Finally, the couple left. But they stopped, and she asked Teos if he knew anything. Specifically, why was Lejar so popular with women? It was that the Count was always courteous and said what you wanted to hear at every moment. That's why she wanted him to be courteous sometimes, to feign a normal relationship. Talos reminded her that Layard was married, so he doubted he could be happy with her. And she knew that perfectly well. Because what happened between them wasn't love. She didn't understand why her friend brought that up, if she couldn't even say she had a girlfriend. At that moment, Talos knelt down, took out a ring, and proposed to her. She didn't understand why he was doing it. If she was an immoral woman, and people would talk. It didn't matter to him. Being by her side was the most important thing. The Duke and the Countess spied from behind a tree. They wanted to know what she would answer. Everything went well. Isilla and Teo left, and Luisa sat on the grass, feeling strange. Isilla's words about her husband echoed in the protagonist's head. Suddenly, the girl realized that she hadn't been very smart all this time. She had the feeling that someone had hit her with the flat side of an axe. Only now did she understand that her husband's love had been extinguished, and she clung to his words like a drowning man to a straw. Because she believed it wouldn't hurt as much. She considered herself a good wife, as she could endure all his infidelities. Luisa understood that her marriage had become a real failure. The man tried to calm her, saying that people are not gods and must make mistakes to be real. He understood that the girl had made a bad decision, but it wasn't only her fault. Luisa thought that the young man probably didn't make such mistakes, and the Duke smiled, pleased that she had such a high opinion of him. But it wasn't like that, and he hired a magician to win the bet, because the rules didn't forbid it. At that moment, the Duke asked her if she would spend the night at his estate. The man wanted an evening fencing session, but she thought of something else. She accepted the training, but her own thoughts had disturbed her. He looked at her sideways and asked if she had thought about it. She denied it, embarrassed, while he kept bothering her. Luisa exploded and blamed Eduardo for her misunderstanding. She got up and moved forward, but he stopped her and asked, "What if he wasn't joking?" The Duke fell silent, waiting for an answer. The protagonist withdrew her hand, saying she would fulfill the wish from the duel. There were only a few days left until the swordsman competition, and they needed to train hard. After a few minutes, they decided to head to the banquet hall as quickly as possible. The Duke perfectly understood that he had proposed spending the night together with the girl. And seriously, upon entering the banquet hall, the first thing Luisa did was approach her husband. He thought she was leaving already, while he decided to stay a little longer. The Count suggested she wait for him for a while, but if she was in a hurry, she could go home without him. But today his escapades mattered little to her, as she planned not to sleep at home. This surprised the young man greatly. At that moment, Eduardo approached and told them it was time, as the carriage had already arrived, and was waiting for them. Layard, however, did not stop her. He just told her they would see each other the next day. The Duke, for his part, wished the Count a good night too. Layard wished the same to his lordship. Since this was the case, the girl took the Duke's hand and said they had to leave. At the same time, she smiled happily. And the Count looked at her sadly as they walked away. Before training, Edward noticed that the girl's ability to provoke her husband had improved a lot. But now he worried that it would be dark in the field, and he would ask her for a real sword fight. The man hoped everything would go well, as she shouldn't kill his apprentice. Louis asked her to try her best, as she could heal wounds, but not severed limbs. At that moment, the young man felt that this girl could kill him if she wanted to. Because when she picks up a sword, she transforms into another person. The fight began and she attacked first, while the Duke blocked that blow. He was amazed that she never used tricks or stratagems, but speed and maneuvers where others wouldn't. Their swords clashed again, and the man thought about when she had managed to enter his heart. At that moment, she lightly hit him on the forehead with her sword and said she had been watching him for minutes. She noticed that he was thinking about everything except the fight. After these words, the Duke decided to concentrate again. Now it was he who attacked first. And right now she understood that he was serious, more than ever. It was a successful counterattack, and the girl could fall as he had the advantage. In a second, she would be on the ground, and the Duke would tell her that he had won this time. Despite this, Luisa was sure that, even if she didn't grab onto him, she could fall without getting hurt. The man also understood that perfectly. Suddenly, she gently touched his cheek. But realizing what she did, she immediately pulled away. He wanted something more. So he placed his hand on her cheek and asked her to touch him as she should, especially if it is what she truly desires. Luisa thought it was a bad idea and said she wouldn't touch him again. The girl seemed distressed. But a very loquacious person had taught her that if a woman is sad, you must put a sword in her hands. Therefore, he raised his sword, although he supposed that in her eyes he wasn't even worthy of her pointing it at him. Luisa accepted the sword and said that before getting married, she was a swordswoman, so sentimental nonsense doesn't matter. Besides, the man understood that both he and the girl were too distracted by external things. So he suggested postponing the training until the morning. Eduardo went to his room and began to change. Luisa stayed in the annex. There was a doctor in the room. He said they should double the dose. The man cannot continue without sleeping. The Duke found it normal. It was only 1 in the morning. But the servant noticed that before he worked until dawn. Benjamin understood his master, but was very worried about him. But Eduardo calmed him down, telling him he wasn't a little boy anymore. The servant understood, and that after returning from the forest, his master worsened. He couldn't stand watching him hurt himself. The Duke insisted. He said that Benjamin's complaints made him lose the desire to sleep. 7 years ago, the former emperor died under mysterious circumstances, and Eduardo suffered assassination attempts on his life daily. It was painful to witness the young man's suffering. The loyal servant feared that history would repeat itself. The emperor was pushing him too hard. The Duke noticed the servant's unease, but assured him that this time he would control everything. Besides, he was ready to fight back, but now he asked Benjamin to show him what he had requested. Meanwhile, in the annex, Luisa was preparing for sleep. She walked back and forth in the room, but sleep simply wouldn't come. At that moment, Eduardo went to see her. He brought her water under the excuse that his servants felt uncomfortable. He thought the bed was uncomfortable, but Luisa said it was better than the one at home. The Duke also saw that the young woman couldn't fall asleep. He understood that he was partly to blame too. So he told her that if she wanted to be alone, he would leave. The young woman felt a little embarrassed and then asked the man to talk with her if he wasn't too busy. Eduardo decided to stay by her side until she fell asleep. But she noticed that someone else had lived there before. The man confessed that he lived in that room when he first moved in, as he needed a place to hide. He didn't know he would sleep there with her, and now he felt wonderful. The Duke admitted he didn't know much about her, so he asked her what she liked. Eduardo bombarded her with questions about her likes and dislikes. They talked for hours, and eventually she fell asleep. The Duke also fell asleep sitting next to her. Luisa quietly approached the sleeping man and gently pushed a lock of hair away from his ear. At that moment, she felt curious to know what he liked. Only now did she realize she hadn't asked him a single question. She remembered saying she wouldn't touch him, and now she was breaking her promise. At that moment, the Duke grabbed her hand tightly. The next second, he pulled her to the floor and pinned her down with his body. He hadn't fully woken up and was asking who had sent her. Luisa, frightened, confessed that it was herself who was there. He didn't answer, and in a moment lost consciousness completely. The young woman felt his fever and understood that he was sick. This moment reminded her of a scene from the past when she saved his life. One thing was clear, even unconscious, the man couldn't relax. She managed to move him a little, but he held her hand firmly. Luisa wanted to take him to bed, but couldn't, so she just took a blanket and covered them both. And she lay down beside him to sleep. The man woke up and realized that, for the first time in a long time, he had slept so peacefully. A girl was lying beside him. What a strange situation. Edward watched her and thought she was very sweet when she frowned. Luisa also woke up, and the Duke asked her why they were sleeping on the floor. The man admitted that he had also had dark thoughts about her. But he was too much of a gentleman for that. They agreed to have breakfast together in the main building and then continue with their training. And at that awkward moment, Maxon caught them red-handed. A sepulchral silence flooded the room. Only now did the Duke remember his appointment with Maxon. Alone, the lieutenant begged the Duke to take care of Louis. Edward realized that his friend had misunderstood him a little. Therefore, the Duke had to explain the situation to the lieutenant from the beginning. Furthermore, both believed that it would be best if Louis divorced Layard and she. And the Duke formalized their relationship. And only then could they protect the young woman from his future actions. Edward knew that Layard would not divorce easily, so he decided to prepare a trap for him. It was bait that no one in the Empire could resist. The day of the tournament selection trials arrived. The young woman was stunned by the crowd. Maxon thought it was because the tournament hadn't been held for a long time, and the Duke was going to compete starting from the final. Edward noticed that people were starting to bet on the tournament winner, so he suggested the girl bet too. The man begged her to bet on him, as he believed he was going to win. But she wasn't so sure. It wasn't that she didn't trust the Duke's strength, but something else. But so the Duke wouldn't be displeased, Maxon said he would bet on him. At that moment, Luisa said she had to leave, as she had other matters to attend to. So she left and left the men alone in the square. The Duke asked his friend what the girl had been doing in recent days. Maxon said she was taking care of the garden, as it was the season for roses to bloom. The lieutenant said he had reserved seats with a good view for them, and they headed to the stands. Edward didn't understand why there was so much noise. Maxon said it was rumored that a well-known guy from the alleys was going to compete. Baltian was the first participant. The Duke thought he looked like a country bumpkin. His opponent was Benny. The spectators noticed they had never heard of Benny, and the weight difference between the rivals was abysmal. The strange thing was that this man came out wearing a mask. Someone thought he had snuck out of his house. And so, the first qualifying contest began. Baltian was sure this victory would be a piece of cake. It seemed to him that this fight would be very simple. While the man was thinking, his opponent broke his sword. At that moment, the commentator announced Benny's victory. No one could believe something like that could happen. The Duke looked at his friend and asked what he thought of the boy. The gentleman could not yet draw conclusions. Benny fled the battlefield, and his opponent was chasing him. The man tried to stop the boy, but he dodged him and asked him what he was doing. Volshin suggested they go for a drink, but Benny said he couldn't, that he had to go to the garden. But then he gave him some advice, telling him that initially his movements had flaws, but if he improved them, he would be better. And then he ran off at full speed. The man was indignant at first, but then suddenly thought that it was a girl. He wasn't wrong, it was Luisa, just wearing a mask and a wig. She decided to participate in the tournament, as something very valuable to her was at stake. Exactly her mother's sword. Taking off the wig, she hurried home. She had to water the roses. Volshin was drinking in the tavern because he knew he had lost to a woman. That's why he was going to get drunk now, and wished no one knew he was defeated by a girl. Luisa was working in the garden and noticed that a caterpillar was sitting on a leaf. She also approached the red roses and told them they were very beautiful. She knew that after the competition, she would have to sort things out with Layard. Furthermore, the girl continued training the Duke and told him that in a couple of weeks would be his first competition. He promised to do well. Suddenly, Edward suggested they watch the other participants' competitions together, because he wanted to study his opponents. Besides, a participant named Benny was there, and he wanted to ask him for his opinion on him. The point was that the boy had defeated his opponent in seconds, so it was difficult to evaluate his skills. But the girl refused, as she had her own plans for that day. Her quick response, without hearing the date, unsettled him a little, and then he dismissed both of Benny's performances. Luisa knew she looked very strange, and the man asked her if she would go to other competitions with him. The girl also refused that, but knew she was lying very unconvincingly. So she decided to tell him a half-truth, which could be interpreted in many ways. Luisa said they shared a physical contract. The Duke understood absolutely nothing of what she said. It was a kind of exercise, similar to what they did together. Edward misunderstood her terribly, thinking she had a lover with whom she spent her nights. He hoped he had misunderstood her, so he decided to ask her if it was what he thought. Or not. It was one of those moments that surprised him, but he refused to believe it was true. The Duke was offended, as he believed he could handle things alone, but she replied that she couldn't entrust that to him. After all, this decision was best for her. Luisa noticed the man's fury, which is why she didn't want to tell him. Benny's last rival was Carlo, a mercenary who often appeared on magazine covers. Believing that Luisa was having an affair with Carlo, the Duke warned her that he would hurt her. The young woman couldn't believe the Duke thought that mercenary could hurt her. Then the Duke said that, although he trusted her, this time he would not support her. And he begged her to reconsider. The protagonist drew her conclusions and said she understood, but they had ignored her for too long. That's why she ruled that she could no longer train someone who didn't trust her. And then she simply turned around and left. The day of the tournament arrived. Maxon and Edward watched Benny's fight. The lieutenant was surprised that Benny already had a nickname, and it was only his third fight. The Duke merely sighed, unaware of the fight, worried about Luisa. A month had passed since their argument. And the Duke doubted whether he should apologize. Maxon was sure that he should. Meanwhile, downstairs, the battle was reaching its peak. Luisa understood that this rival was stronger, and she couldn't use the same tactic. With no escape, she showed a move no one had seen before, and thus she shattered her opponent's sword. The Duke applauded Benny, who had reached the final, while Maxon began to suspect something. So after the fight, he ran after Benny, who was Luisa, and caught up with her. She took off her mask and turned to him, telling him she knew he would deduce everything. The young man didn't seem very surprised, but Luisa thought the Duke had told him. Maxon was now astonished, as he didn't expect Edward to know anything about this. The girl believed the young man was pretending. That's why their differences arose. Luisa thought Edward had been dismissive of her fencing skills. After all, the Duke said her rival would hurt her when he himself was competing. And he doubted her. Afterwards, her friend asked her what she had said to the Duke at the start of the fight, and she repeated every word. Maxon stared at her, realizing she had told it to the man who considered himself her lover. The lieutenant explained to her how it actually sounded, and the girl was consumed by shame, unable to imagine her words being heard that way. Now she understood that Eduardo thought she was having an affair with his rival. Luisa didn't know how to clear up the misunderstanding, if she wasn't even interested in suitors. Suddenly, she realized that the Duke didn't know she was competing in the tournament. Just at that moment, Eduardo saw Carlo tenderly hugging a girl. The man started following the couple and saw that the mercenary had already changed companions several times. This enraged the Duke, so he decided to use his magical abilities. He showed the traitor the most terrifying illusion he could imagine. Shortly after, the newspapers announced that Carlo was a faithful man, but his companion was not Luisa. The man thought that, although the young woman would have a hard time at first, she would recover later. Maxon noticed that his friend was in a very good mood. Luisa asked a friend to hide her participation in the competition from the Duke. The final battles began, and the Duke won part of the duels without problems. So Edward defeated his opponent easily and reached the tournament final. Maxon understood that, in addition to the sword, the Duke was using his magical powers. Tomorrow was the tournament final, and the Duke was sure to defeat Benny easily. The Duke was surprised that Lincia hadn't come to the tournament to claim her sword. He also supposed that something might have happened to young Lincia. He was going to get the prize and then find the dragon winner. Wherever she was, Maxon thought about how the Duke would react upon learning that he found Lincia's daughter. On the day of the final, the Emperor and the temple priest came to watch the fight. And so, the Duke and Benny entered the arena. Only now did Edward realize that Luisa was hiding behind the mask. They greeted each other. Now he understood the origin of Benny's skills, and she just wanted to finish quickly. Furthermore, Luisa revealed that she had only one lover, and that he was not a libertine. The girl didn't come just to wield the sword, but to take the grand prize. The Duke was unaware of her motives, but decided to fight honorably and keep his promise. She also wished this contest to be fair. The contenders prepared for combat. The adversaries crossed swords. Edward managed to resist and block the young woman's attack. And the man masterfully dodged her blow, although it cost our young hero dearly. The girl broke contact between them. Maxon noticed that the Duke was holding up well against Luisa. And that's despite her only using a part of her power. Edward counterattacked quite effectively. The Emperor became interested in Benny. It had been so long since he met someone like this. The Duke perceived that the girl's balance was failing. But she noticed that the man possessed a power called luck. Eduardo charged at Luisa again. The man was exhausted and sensed that after the battle, their master-student relationship would fade away. Luisa blocked his blow perfectly, while he wished their reunion would last forever. Anyway, Luisa decided to end the fight and snatched the sword from his hands with a clean strike. And then, the young woman pointed the sharp blade directly at his throat. The man understood that the young woman had defeated him. There was no doubt. But even at that moment, he was smiling and confessed how much he had missed her. What a moment! They announced the girl as the winner. And she was smiling, because she also missed the Duke terribly. Luisa and Eduard ascended to the stand together. A moment of great tension. The Duke knew that by revealing her identity, she would face problems. Not only because of her gender, but for being Layard's wife. He worried that the young woman would get entangled in dangerous imperial intrigues. The Emperor proclaimed his pride in Benny's skill, that is, Luisa's. The man longed to see the face of his half-brother's conqueror. His Majesty wanted to discover who was hiding behind the mask. At that moment, Balshan burst into the arena. He had something to say. He begged for permission to reveal something about Benny. The Emperor nodded, and they activated the magic speaker. The man believed that if Benny's identity came to light, many talented swordsmen would hide in the shadows. That's why he implored them to keep Benny's secret. The emperor became furious. He considered that man to be wasting his valuable time. Maxian decided to support the swordsman and shouted that they should back Benny. Although irritated, the emperor saw an opportunity to use the situation for a good image campaign. On one hand, he decided not to reveal Benny's identity. But on the other, he needed to know to whom he would hand over the crown jewel. And he ordered Benny to approach him. Luisa knew she couldn't avoid the encounter with the emperor, and it was highly probable he would recognize her. She understood that the emperor could not only recognize her, but also interrogate her about her skills. But the duke asked her not to be afraid, as nothing bad would happen, and begged her to remember that her name was Benny. And nothing more. She didn't understand what was happening, but she decided to trust the duke. The young woman approached the emperor and pronounced her fake name. Meanwhile, Edward cast a spell and influenced His Majesty, and the young woman confirmed everything he asked her. The emperor demanded that she remove the mask, and that is exactly what she did. The man saw an altered face, so he judged her as ordinary. Just then, the emperor's mother spoke and clarified the heroine's name. The woman thought she had a very kind person before her. His Majesty stood up and approached Luisa carrying Lynch's sword. The young woman carefully took her mother's sword. Luisa looked at him sadly, but it was that sword, her mom's sword. The duke congratulated her once more on her victory. Eduardo knew he hadn't kept his promise to Lyncha, but he wasn't sad, because Luisa was happy holding that sword. The girl thanked the duke for his help, although she didn't understand how he did it. The man said a known wizard helped them. The competition ended, and the emperor decided to give a speech. The man and the woman paid no attention. They realized they were holding hands. The duke reminded the countess that if they continued like that, people would think they had an unconventional relationship. And that's what the emperor thought. He believed the rumors about his brother were true, and that's why he decided to allow the couple to remain on good terms. After the competition, the oracle was supposed to give its prophecy. The temple servant announced that the oracle would confirm the resurgence of the black dragon. 20 years ago, the creature became enraged and destroyed everything in its path. But then, the emperor and the swordsman managed to defeat the evil. The priest interpreted the oracle's words. The dragon is the emperor, and the darkness is the black magic left after his death. The cleric thought the new emperor would eradicate dark magic. A shadow covered the protagonist's face. It was a show for the emperor. But the oracle's words made her fear that the dragon's rebirth would be a terrible reality. Perhaps that's why her mother's sword ended up in her hands. Immediately after, the emperor congratulated the winner and the runner-up again. His Majesty stated that, with such talents, peace reigned in the empire and offered them a special mission. He ordered Edward and Luisa to go to the Peril's forest and investigate the strange happenings. The duke felt the defeat, but the worst part was that the girl was also under scrutiny. He obeyed his brother's order, but he was surprised that the girl did the same. The tournament was over. The duke apologized to her and promised he would figure something out. The man worried a lot about her, but he shouldn't have, as she lived 20 years in that forest. The duke did not expect this turn of events at all. Never. The tournament ended, and Luisa told Eduardo that she lived in that forest, and that Lyncha is her mother. Maxian also lived there for a time in his childhood. How intense. The man worried about his past master, and Luisa was pleased to know that he was also trying to recover her mother's sword. The duke was curious to know if the count knew who Luisa really was. But he only knew her maiden name, and that was it. Luisa was sad, as she was hiding many things from her husband. Poor thing. Furthermore, she had no idea how to tell him that she was going to the forest. What a dilemma. The duke, for his part, was opposed to her going there. No way. Luisa didn't understand why he wanted her to stay in the city, but the man didn't want to expose her to danger. It infuriated him that he told someone who had lost to her. What worried him was that only men would go to the forest. That's why he didn't want to take her, as everyone would sleep two to a tent. Luisa thought she could sleep in the tent with Maxian. The girls saw no problem, as they lived together and he saw her bathing. Besides, she promised not to harass the boy like before. Luisa insisted, saying she received orders from the emperor and was irreplaceable. The duke gave in and decided to prepare another tent just for her. The girl was happy with this decision. Her husband remained. Before the trip, she would decide to divorce. The men did not expect this turn of events. It wasn't just the trip, but their marriage no longer made sense. The men were left alone, and Maxion said that Luisa would have immense power. The duke noticed that the girl said she would participate in the campaign, but she did not mention any betrayal. Eduardo understood that if Luisa associated with them, she would also be a traitor. And if his plan failed, they would harm her. The duke understood that, since everything turned out this way, they had to find another way. He thought that in the middle of the campaign, he could change everything and find a place for the girl to teach fencing. Eduardo was busy with his affairs in his office. The man understood that the count had his own objectives, so he wasn't going to let Luisa go. The duke conjured a bird to carry the letter to its recipient. It was a trap for Layard. Layard went to see His Highness. The emperor asked him to sit down, as they had something to celebrate. The count understood nothing, but an official letter from Fendel had arrived. The princess was coming to visit them. Since the death of the old emperor and the coronation of a legate, his illegitimate son, the neighboring king had not visited his country. Layard did not expect this, but it was a great opportunity for him. The count believed that, after 7 years of a legate as emperor, Fendel recognized him. Layard called the emperor a wise ruler who cares about his people. The count served wine to his majesty and congratulated him once more. A legate begged the count to seduce Princess Fendel. This was to deeply hurt the duke, as the princess was his first love. Layard doubted his success. If the princess was beautiful, she wouldn't pay attention to him. The emperor said there were rumors that the princess was looking for a man for her harem. The count pleaded being married, but the emperor didn't care and ordered him to divorce. At that moment, the man remembered his wife. He had never thought about divorce before. Higgett didn't understand his subject's reaction. He didn't believe he loved that prude. Layard knew the emperor was right. He married Louise only because she accepted everything. He knew the young woman would tolerate his adventures and that no one would help her in her suffering. She was just a tool to achieve his ambitious goals. The emperor noticed that Layard must be fed up with acting as a gigolo. Now the emperor used him, claiming that only being the princess's lover would bring him success. And when the duke dies, Layard will receive part of his inheritance. The count understood that it was a good opportunity for him, but his wife wouldn't leave his mind. Meanwhile, Luisa went to the store and bought special fertilizer for flowers. Leaving the store, she saw a beautiful woman insulting some men like a carter. Luisa knew the young woman was from a neighboring kingdom, and she kept insulting the men. When a lout reached out his hands towards the girl, her bodyguard subdued him. Looking at the protagonist, the stranger thought she was a real beauty. And then she ran towards Louis and hugged her tightly. Such behavior embarrassed the girl, and she begged her to let go. The stranger confessed that she freezes when she sees handsome people, and then asked if Louis knew where Duke Lindemann's mansion was in the city. Diana reached the Duke before the scheduled official visit. She arrived early because, upon receiving his letter, she thought it was the document itself. Edward thought the girl would contact him by letter. But the truth is that the man promised her a gift. That's why she came and couldn't wait to receive it. Many years ago, when Diana came here to study, the Duke always helped her. Then he made a lot of money and always sent Edward around. But the young man soon unmasked her false identity. From that day on, they became friends. So the girl understood that, if he called her before time, his target was Lady Clote. The man didn't expect his friend to find Louis, but fate brought them together on the commercial street. Besides, he often saw the girl's portrait in the newspapers. The Duke asked her not to bother Louis. Diana was sure that Edward preferred men, but now it seems he liked both genders. But the problem was that Louis had no idea about his plan. The Duke knew the Count wouldn't let Louis go, so he decided to give him a push. and Diana was happy to take away a handsome man. Because otherwise, during the overthrow of the emperor, he would be forced to kill the count. That's why he asked Diana to take Ledyard to Fendel. The princess reminded the young man that, although he was doing it for Louis, this could be a cause for future misunderstandings. The Duke understood this perfectly. Diana was leaving, but he asked her to review a document from the butler. Eduardo, alone, planned the post-expedition rebellion against the empire. Louis should not get involved in this. The protagonist was tending the garden flowers, pricked her finger among the roses. She had to sort things out, even with her husband, but she wanted to leave on good terms. Just at that moment, Ledyard approached her. He wanted to walk with her, but she suggested walking together because of her wound. They walked in silence until he told a boring story. In an instant, Luisa stopped and affirmed that she understood that her husband wanted to talk. But he was postponing it. The Count proposed divorce to her. The man said his feelings hadn't disappeared, but he couldn't explain the reason at that moment. Ledyard hoped the Duke would die on the expedition, which is why he offered her a 6-month divorce. Luisa didn't listen to his nonsense and accepted the divorce. The Count thought she would suffer a lot, but something went wrong, so he thought he was saving his pride. The man believed that soon all obstacles would disappear, and he could be with his one true love. He wanted his wife not to do anything rash and to wait a little. Now the young woman was furious, as she didn't understand Ledyard's actions. Luisa cried because her husband was hurting her feelings once again. Suddenly, the girl noticed that she had wandered far from home and was in a new market. The merchants were about to clip the little bird's wings so it couldn't fly. The man said the female had been caught and tamed, and the male was raised in captivity. But they didn't cut the tendons. Luisa said she would buy those birds and beg them not to mutilate them. The problem was that she forgot the money at home, but Eduardo approached and paid for the birds. The man said he had arrived there by chance, as he was lost. Also, the Duke asked for a large and beautiful cage for the birds. Eduardo asked Luisa if she liked the cage, and she replied yes. The Duke noticed that he encountered her quite often in those places. And the girl said she would pay him back the money when she received the prizes. He gave her the birds, as it was a gift for the young woman. Luisa thanked him for that. Edward noticed that the protagonist had been crying. The girl didn't expect it to be so obvious. He thought it was because of the birds, but it wasn't. Luisa confessed that Ledyard had proposed divorce to her. The issue was that, although she also thought about separating, it hurt and was unexpected. The protagonist said she had a secret. She wasn't a naive country girl who didn't understand anything. By signing the prenuptial agreement, she began to understand some things about life. But for the most part, she was a fool. Because the cage she lived in also protected her. She knew that Ledyard had used her. But she also used him. Yes, there was love too. But it ended. And now she wanted to leave with dignity, not kicked out. That's why she asked Eduardo for help. Ledyard noticed that Luisa packed her suitcase and offered her to stay at his residence, as she had nowhere to go. But she replied that it was unnecessary because the Duke had come to pick up Luisa. The Count did not expect this, and Eduardo commented that he had arrived just in time. The girl ignored her husband, handed her suitcase to the Duke, and Ledyard tried to stop her. Luisa turned to her husband and told him she had left the divorce document on his desk. And she asked him to sign it and send it to her. With that, she ended her married life. The Count tried to stop the girl because he thought she was making a mistake. He had asked her to wait 6 months. The man said he loved her, but she wasn't entirely convinced. Is it true? It sounded unconvincing, but at that moment she also loved him. Ledyard considered their divorce temporary. That's why he begged her to wait a little. But just the instant she took the sword, she realized she no longer loved Ledyard. The man didn't believe she could leave him so easily. Although in truth, the decision was very difficult. The Count held her hand and begged her to wait 6 months. Afterwards, he would give her everything she desired. The girl freed her hand and stated that it was already too late. There was no turning back. The Count was petrified, as if struck by lightning, while the girl walked away forever. They got into the Duke's carriage and headed towards him. She asked for his forgiveness for involving him in all this. Suddenly, the man noticed she had hurt her finger and told her that upon arriving at the mansion. They must treat the wound. Luisa thanked him for his concern. Furthermore, the girl confessed that she had freed the birds and that they were now flying around. Meanwhile, Leijard couldn't believe that his girl had left him and that she was none other than Luisa. He hoped that in 6 months, her anger would subside and they would be together again. For the first time, he began to understand the meaning of her words. The Count blamed the Duke for everything and believed he had corrupted his wife. He entered the room where Luisa had lived for 2 years. Her things were gone and it was very cold, except for a small canary that had returned to its cage. He closed the cage door and thought the girl shouldn't go too far, lest he regret it later. The Count was sure that Luisa would return to him. Now he ate breakfast in complete solitude. What irony! Layard had never seen himself like this, and he didn't understand why. Just then, a servant brought a letter from the palace. Its content did not cheer up the young man at all. Even so, he hoped it would be the last time he did it. He dressed elegantly and left for his date with the princess. He was going to give her an exclusive tour of the castle. Diana stared at him intently and asked if he was the married man famous for his affairs and beauty. Layard did not deny it, and Diana instantly knew he was trying to seduce her. But she said she wasn't very interested in second-hand goods. The Count confessed that he divorced of his own free will to serve her, and also proposed that she personally find out which rumors about him are true and which are not. In that case, her curiosity was piqued. Can he prove what he says? If everything was as he claimed, the princess wanted to verify it with her own eyes. Meanwhile, Luisa was reading newspapers and noticed that the rumors of her divorce were still alive. So the Duke asked her to stay home. But Luisa wanted to find and buy a house, although the Duke suggested she do it after returning from the forest. She agreed and said that, for now, she would stay with him a little longer. Suddenly, a servant arrived with a letter from the emperor himself. The Duke thought it was an invitation to the banquet for the princess's arrival. But not only was he invited, Luisa was too. This surprised the girl greatly, since only close people were invited to those parties. The Duke understood that it was surely Diana's doing, and he didn't like that at all. That's why he didn't want Luisa to go. She would have to meet the Count. Eduardo was very worried about her, but Luisa decided to go. It was no longer worth worrying so much about Layard. The protagonist was sure that the man would also feel awkward. Princess Fendel would be there. After all, she was his first love. Eduardo didn't understand who had told him that. The girl admitted that her mother believed the Duke, and the princess had always gotten along wonderfully as children. But that was an invention, a complete lie. They were the same age. So the servants, seeing the girl's mischief, thought they were a couple. In their youth, it was the same, since they handled confidential matters and were often misinterpreted. Eduardo didn't expect the newspapers to publish that, so he told Luisa that. Although he knew Diana, he never loved her. The girl agreed, since her mother had told her that, as a child, the Duke was an ugly boy. At one point, the man understood that Lincia did not want her daughter to have anything to do with him or his relatives. However, the girl became someone close to him, so he apologized to his mother. Suddenly, the conversation turned to the girl's father, and she said his name was Alan, and that he also worked for the imperial family. The Duke knew his father very well, as he was the best healer in the imperial palace, and also the head of the Serbinian family. Luisa confessed that her father always hid his origin and told her nothing about it. Eduardo believed the man was dead, as the report he was studying was deliberate forgery. Suddenly, the girl became curious about her relatives. It turns out she had a first cousin, the leader of his clan. She thought her cousin worked for the emperor himself. Oh, surprise! Her relatives no longer frequented high society, and many aristocrats died with the former emperor. There was talk of the execution of rebel aristocrats, including her uncle. Luisa didn't understand how her family could support a rebellion. Eduardo was sure that wasn't the case, that the execution was a huge mistake. After that event, her brother left for his lands and now lives there. The place was on the way to his expedition, so they could make a visit. Luisa never thought about her origin, but now she longed to meet her relatives. She always saw herself as a commoner. Her husband scorned her surname, but now everything had changed, and she looked forward to a banquet with the imperial family. Afterwards, the Duke and Luisa went to Filio and asked for a dress in 2 days. Of course she succeeded. And now the girl went out in her new outfit. The protagonist was very pleased with this result. The designer was happy that her dress suited her so well. Eduardo was speechless at Luisa's beauty. Finally, he stood up, approached her, and told her the outfit looked perfect on her. The Duke thought the least he could do was pay for a dress for her for the imperial banquet. Filio found the perfect red shoes to complement the dress. And so, the Duke and Luisa arrived at the princess's welcome banquet at the imperial palace. The aristocrats, as one, began to comment on her and concluded that, after the divorce, Luisa looked much more radiant. But that didn't bother her so much anymore, as she had gotten used to it. Her surname became the new topic of gossip. People believed she was from a lateral branch of the Serbinian family. It irritated her that people knew more about her family than she did. So the young woman changed the subject and said she had already met the princess. At that moment, Princess Diana appeared in the hall. The young woman was beautiful, and Leylard accompanied her. The rumors were varied, and the princess and the count approached Luisa and Eduardo. Someone said that the one who had been abandoned was Luisa, and that she had turned to the Duke. She retracted her words about being used to being the center of attention. She didn't understand why people were talking so much. So the Duke suggested they go out to the veranda. A little earlier, Diana approached them, greeted them, and thanked the girl for helping her last time. Luisa said she was glad for that help, but looking at her ex-husband, she understood that it was not surprising that he was with the princess. The girl confessed that the ball had been quite uncomfortable, but she hoped that at least today would be a little different. But just as she and the Duke were heading for the exit, someone tried to stop her. She didn't expect that someone to be Leylard. The man begged her to talk to him. Then Eduardo intervened, protecting his companion with his body and saying he had nothing to talk about. But the count insisted. Leylard was quite persistent, although the Duke didn't like it. He said that Luisa was the one who decided, and the girl agreed to talk to her ex. They went out onto the balcony, and Luisa asked the man to get straight to the point. He noticed that his wife got along well with another, and she admitted it, slightly hurting the count. The princess gave him a bracelet the night before. This way, he would hear everything he said to his wife, as he needed proof of their breakup. Leylard began his speech by apologizing to Luisa, and then added that he had never loved her for a single minute. He realized that only after reuniting with the princess, because his whole life he had only loved her. Then he thanked her for divorcing him, as now he could start fresh with Diana. Luisa congratulated him and asked if that was all or if there was anything else to say. The count deactivated the bracelet and begged the girl to leave the Duke, as he was a dangerous man. At that moment, she felt a slight relief and said she no longer loved him. After wishing him happiness with the princess, he left. She was leaving one man behind and heading toward another who was waiting for her. But Diana got ahead of her, appearing on the veranda next to the count. She arrived with a confession. She thought that in person, he wouldn't be so angry. Eduardo didn't expect her to eavesdrop, but she needed proof. Upon hearing everything, the Duke burst into anger. He hurt Louis. Diana was justifying herself. It wasn't her intention. The princess didn't believe the count felt anything for his wife, but her objective was more than obvious. The Duke understood her reasoning, but he was worried that Louis would suffer again. Just at that moment, the Duke's gift called her to the veranda. But the worst part is that Luisa overheard the entire conversation. Neither the Duke nor the princess expected this turn. The girl didn't understand why they were talking about her and eavesdropping on her chat. Diana confessed that she just wanted to make sure that the count and the countess had broken up. Nothing more. Luisa replied that she did not regret breaking up with her husband at all. With that settled, the girl wanted to hear the rest of the story from the Duke's mouth. That being the case, the princess prepared to leave. In an instant, she left that terrace. The protagonist now only wanted to know what it meant that Layard was a gift from the Duke to the princess. Eduardo remained silent. He didn't know how to start this uncomfortable conversation. The girl was stunned and didn't know how to interpret that the man had handed the count over to the princess. He confessed to having planned everything. He feared Layard would deny her the divorce. That shocked her. She herself was going to resolve it. The Duke doubted her too much. It hurt her that, in his eyes, she couldn't even get a divorce on her own. Luisa was bewildered. She never expected that side of the man. So, to sort out her thoughts, she decided to be the first to leave. She left and Edward sighed, alone on the balcony. Maxim was reading the newspapers. Nonsense about the princess, the count, the Duke, and Luisa. The lieutenant knew the quarrel was real. And he asked what happened between the two. After the confession, the friend understood that, for Luisa, it was the worst thing possible. The knight proposed telling her the truth. War and her safety were at stake. But the Duke thought that, for her safety, it was better to hide the truth from her. That's why Eduardo wanted to keep the girl away from the expedition. He decided to distance himself so as not to hurt her. Meanwhile, Luisa continued training without rest. Even though she was exhausted, her skills were improving by leaps and bounds. Still, she felt sad because Eduardo hadn't apologized, nor had he even visited her. She understood that the man was avoiding her on purpose. Shut up in his office, Luisa feared she had lost the Duke's trust, and that mortified her. Just then, he arrived at the training ground and saw her practicing late. She told him she was angry, and then asked him what brought him so late. The Duke understood that he acted arrogantly and should have consulted her first. The problem was also that he couldn't trust her. How much longer would she have lived like this if he hadn't intervened? Furthermore, this situation helped him understand that he cannot depend on her. Luisa suddenly realized that he didn't want to go on the excursion with her, so she wished him good luck. And she left. Preparations for the expedition were in full swing. Maxim noticed that the Duke was too tense, so he asked him to relax a little. Exactly 3 days had passed since Luisa left home. That's why it was hard for him to concentrate on the review, and he asked Maxim to finish it. The Duke was suffering, as even the dependency where the girl lived no longer seemed appealing to him. Meanwhile, the young woman was busy shopping. Strange as it may seem, vendors still recognized the girl, as her photos often appeared in newspapers. She didn't want to be rude to the vendors, so she introduced herself with her father's surname. The saleswoman felt sorry for the girl and then told her she didn't need men, and she should enjoy her life. Luisa confessed that she feared these situations, which is why she put on a hat with a visor. The day of the expedition's start arrived, and the Duke and his army set off on campaign. Everyone commented on his beautiful appearance. The most interesting thing was that, at the end of the column, Benny joined them. The procession left the capital, but it wasn't the real Benny, but an imposter played by one of the Duke's men. The knight was sure that the boy with his skills and abilities would be useful to him. Another knight said that Benny's participation was an imperial whim, and that they had no right to take an inexperienced person on the expedition. Maxim demanded silence from his friends, as there were still people watching them from the walls. Everyone, without exception, noticed the Duke's strange silence, which meant something was worrying him. Maxim approached him and asked how he felt. But he didn't like his friend's attitude, and the Duke suddenly bolted forward, sending his horse into a gallop. He wanted to concentrate on his work, but upon reaching the hill, he froze in surprise. Down there. Luisa was waiting for them. The men didn't expect to see her, so they froze for an instant, not knowing what to do. Maxim didn't understand what the girl was doing there. Edward said he would go down to see her, and that the lieutenant and the squadron should wait for him there. Luisa greeted him as if nothing had happened. The man asked her directly what she was doing there. The protagonist thought a lot about his words, but she didn't understand why he was acting like that. She still couldn't believe he didn't deserve her trust, enough to say those hurtful things to her. The problem was that she only saw the good in him, but he was an ordinary man with flaws. Luisa admitted that she had lived in the capital like a flower in a greenhouse. But did he really believe she didn't know anything? Her ex-husband ran to the emperor's side as soon as he called him. The duke, on the other hand, was a deposed heir exiled to a dangerous place. With all that information, she deduced that the man had rejected her for her safety. But she didn't want safety, she only wanted to be by the duke's side because upon taking the sword, she understood that she wanted to protect him at all costs. It was the final blow. The duke lost control and hugged the girl. Eduardo knew she was risking too much by being by his side, but that made him happy. They apologized to each other, and she begged his permission to go on the expedition with him. They resolved everything between them, but he didn't know how to introduce her to the squadron. Luisa devised a plan, and they approached the members of the squadron. She put on a mask and met the others, who were sure she couldn't join. The duke explained to Maxon that he had cast a spell on Luisa, and that she would look like this for a while. They had to continue on their way, while Benny traveled by cart until buying a horse in the village. She couldn't show herself to the squadron in her appearance. Everyone knew her as the duke's mistress. Maxon was stunned by the duke's abilities. Not only her appearance, but also her voice had changed. Edward confessed that he wanted to ride with her on the same horse. But to everyone, she was a man. It would be very strange. Luisa feared he would waste too much magic on her. But he assured her he wouldn't hurt her. Not at all. Still, the men wanted to know how long Benny would last. She said, "Until I show my skills." And so the squadron moved forward again, with the mission in mind. The squadron reached the village and sat down in the tavern. Time to eat and drink. Luisa asked the boys to look after her. Can they protect sweet Benny? One of the knights, with latent curiosity, asked permission to see Lynch's sword. Another knight begged Robin to stop harassing the rookie with his questions. But the girl promised to show the boy the sword tomorrow, during training. She thought Eduardo's group members were calm and intelligent, but they were unique. And active. The duke worried if she knew how to drink. And it turned out the girl drank 3 pitchers of beer. Eduardo didn't take his eyes off Luisa, because she was blushing and looked adorable. But just as she tried to stand up, she tangled her feet and almost fell. But she didn't fall. The duke caught her, and she thanked him for it. Eduardo decided to accompany her upstairs and warned the knights, "Watch your consumption." At that moment, seeing his friend smile, Maxon felt jealous of the captain. Since childhood, he had taken care of her. But now his care was no longer necessary for her. He left his companions and went to his rooms, remembering how little Luisa used to smile at him. Remembering how they played happily and carelessly in those times. Meanwhile, the duke took the girl to his room and told her she would sleep in the next one. Immediately after, he offered her a necklace as a gift. It was a kind of protective amulet, so he begged her not to take it off during the expedition. But Luisa couldn't accept such a valuable gift. Similar amulets were worn by all members of the squadron, including himself. And Luisa, once again, realized that he was a very considerate man. The man put the pendant on her and confessed that, in reality, he didn't consider himself a good person. However, he wanted to look good in her eyes. The protagonist thought she was too drunk, as there was no other reason for her heart to beat so fast. Edward noticed that the jewel suited her wonderfully. Luisa thanked him and headed to her room. Upon entering, she felt something strange happening. In the morning, everyone prepared for training. But the girl overslept. Not only was she late, but the duke was too. He was hoping to have breakfast together. What drama! It turned out that the captain skipped almost all training sessions. Now she had to forget about it. The girl dragged him to train. Maxon was surprised to see Benny and Eduard training. He wanted to slip away, but Luisa forced him to train with everyone. The girl announced that the duke would not miss the training sessions, and Robin celebrated that the rookie was joining. Robin didn't know why the captain changed his mind, but he was very happy about it. Luisa made a bold decision. She would participate in the practice fights. The Duke supported the idea, knowing it would benefit his seasoned knights. Moreover, Minnie hadn't fought in a while. So the Duke asked Luisa if she minded. Robin offered himself first, but Luisa wasn't going to mince words. She demanded that he give it his all. Upon understanding the situation, Robin got a stomach cramp and was removed from training. With no other volunteers, the Duke decided to keep the young warrior company. The girl thought it was the perfect opportunity to impress the knights. Luisa was sure she would soon become another knight. The Duke said that when his knights trusted her, he would lift her spell. So they prepared for battle. The moment of truth had arrived. They began to fight. Luisa attacked first, without hesitating for a second. The Duke tried to block her blow, but her force was relentless. She stepped back and, without giving the Duke a break, unleashed a series of blows. Robin suddenly realized that Benny was playing with the Duke. She could end this with one blow. The girl snatched the sword from him. The Duke fell, and Luisa pointed her sword at him. After that, everyone wanted to fight her, and the Duke broke his spell. All the knights were shocked. Before them was no longer Benny, but Lady Luisa. Robin couldn't believe what he was seeing and asked someone to slap him. The Duke hit him, and the boy knew it hurt, so everything was true. Then, Edward officially introduced the girl to everyone. The girl apologized to the knights for deceiving them, but it was necessary for them to recognize her. The men were very happy, as they considered her a very talented girl. Each of them wanted to fight her. Then it was the knight's turn. She broke one of their swords. The Duke and Maction watched her. The man asked his friend if anyone had ever defeated the girl in combat. The lieutenant confessed that no one ever had been able to defeat the girl. That being the case, Luisa's participation in training was necessary. For a while, their journey proceeded without issues. Apart from the forest, black magic thrived in certain parts of the empire. But they were not a threat. In the villages they passed through, absolute order and tranquility reigned. The closer they got to the capital, the farther people were from the conflict zone. They had been traveling for 2 weeks and were closer to the forest than to the capital. The group stopped, and the Duke proposed to the girl that they visit her relatives. Eduardo told her he wouldn't mind if she stayed there, but she insisted on accompanying him until the end. Suddenly, someone called the Duke, as he needed to take a look at something important. It occurred to Luisa that she needed to buy perfume in the next village. They organized an improvised camp, and Maction carefully examined the apples. The man remembered when, as a child, he used to prepare food for his friend when her teacher was away. At that moment, the Duke and Luisa approached, as they wanted to support their friend. But Maction politely refused help. The Duke had never cooked, but Luisa swore she would do great, having lived alone for so long. Still, the lieutenant didn't want the girl to get her hands dirty. The truth is that the boy knew that neither Lincia nor Luisa had culinary talent. The girl understood that there was logic in that. Then, the Duke proposed that Luisa spend time together. They had unfinished business. The man and the woman left to resolve their matters. Maction stayed cooking and watched the couple walk away for a long time. He remembered an image from his childhood, when a girl walked beside him, smiling at him like Luisa was now smiling at the Duke. He realized that the girl who was his world suddenly vanished, and another appeared. To him, Luisa was always family, and he longed to reunite with her. But now everything was different. Meanwhile, Luisa and Eduardo were in the forest, and the man asked her to run away and hide. It was a kind of training, as his intention was to find her in that forest. The protagonist suddenly realized that a pendant would help him in that task. The girl told him she would flee so far away that even he would start to worry. He gave her a 100-second head start. The man knew it was a normal forest, but perils contained mana, so magic stones failed there. But in this forest, it was easy to find a person. And that is exactly what he did. Luisa was surprised at how quickly the Duke found her, as she hadn't even sensed his presence. No matter where she hid, the Duke always found her. Luisa began to notice that a rose scent preceded Eduardo. This time he found her again, and she stumbled, falling onto him. The protagonist was fine, but she worried when she heard a strange sound. Everything was fine, except for a bump, and she wanted to check the hit area. Her head was fine, but the girl was too close to him. He also wanted to know how she knew where he would appear. Luisa said it was because of the rose scent, but he didn't wear cologne. So he wanted to check. She was confused. She didn't understand where that aroma that she sensed since their first meeting came from. He was beginning to understand, but he didn't tell her. He simply picked her up. It had been a long time since they showed themselves as a couple. The Duke said that the knights doubted their relationship, as they seemed distant. The girl had grown close to the squadron. She thought about telling everything, but Eduardo opposed it. He loved being her lover. And boy, did he love it. Suddenly, he asked if she had ever been to the sea. She hadn't, but he spoke of an academy on the coast, where he was in charge. The best mages and swordsmen used to train there. Everything changed, but he wanted her to be a professor after the mission. But only afterwards, as now he didn't want to be separated from her. Luisa felt the same, exactly the same. Back at the camp, Robin treated the Duke's wounds, indignant at his recklessness. Not even magic helped him this time, but he demanded silence, that Luisa shouldn't know anything. Maxion understood. The Duke carried her so that she wouldn't see the blood. But the captain insisted that he only wanted to hug Luisa. Nothing more. After Robin left, Eduardo asked the lieutenant if Luisa had always smelled manna. Maxion was listening for the first time. But in the forest, he could distinguish smells and sense the weather. Just at that moment, she entered the shop and asked if the men were going to have dinner. She brought food to the Duke. He forgot that his friend hadn't eaten either and fled when called by others. The perfect image of the past shattered in Maxion's mind. Time passed. Luisa was standing guard, worried about the swelling on her face. At that moment, Eduardo approached her and greeted her kindly. She couldn't answer. A knight ran out shouting that there was a tragedy. The problem was that Maxion wasn't waking up. The situation was critical. The problem was that he couldn't wake up. Eduardo thought the cause was black magic. Until that moment, no one noticed changes in the lieutenant's behavior or state. But the boys found a black gem and believed it was used as a tool. They knew that gems were the color of the owner's mana. But when using black magic, they turned black. This spell seemed like a curse and wouldn't break even after the caster's death. They had to break its conditions. The Duke understood that they needed to find a crack in the spell. Only then would the magic be destroyed. Eduardo gave instructions to the knights and asked Luisa and Robin to check on Maxion's condition. Robin was almost crying over the lieutenant and begged him to open his eyes. The boy didn't understand magic at all, so he thought that perhaps, physically, he could revive his friend. So he asked Luisa to hit Maxion. At first she hesitated, but then decided to try. In the end, she overdid it, as she had a heavy hand. The Duke entered and begged her to stop, because with her effort, Maxion would need a doctor. The day passed, Maxion didn't wake up, so they put him on the cart and left. Luisa sat beside him and pleaded for him to wake up. Strangely, Luisa confessed that since yesterday she felt her friend was emitting a rose scent. Edward said it was unlikely, but since everything had turned out this way, he would ask his relatives for help. Luisa thanked him, as she was very worried about her friend. It had been a long time since she had seen Max sleep so peacefully, so she wondered what dreams he might be having. So they finally arrived in Airn. The girl noticed that precisely they were not welcome. It was all due to a strange illness affecting the inhabitants, including her cousin. The man understood that, for the locals, the visit of the Imperial Knights boded no good. They finally arrived, and the girl's relatives came out to greet them. Indace assured the Duke that they were happy to welcome him to their humble lands. Eduardo interrupted Luisa's conversation and asked her to accompany him. It turned out they had also invited her to the main castle, and the Duke asked if she was wearing her father's brooch. The man explained that since her brother was sick, her mother was in charge of everything. He warned the protagonist that her aunt was a very strict and authoritarian woman. So at first, it would be hard for the girl to get along with her. Despite everything, Luisa wasn't too scared and went to the appointment with her aunt. Then they entered the room where the woman was waiting for them. Edward admitted that it had been a long time since he had seen Lady Lorraine. Luisa also introduced herself to the woman and then handed over her father's brooch and said that his name was Alan and that he was the head of these places. Lorraine was surprised and then asked if the girl was Luisa herself.